All right, I have been wanting to do a discussion on Thucydides in a long format like this for a long time. Now, I don't normally do long format discussions because I put a lot of effort into these recordings so that not a single minute of your time listening is wasted. And so normally what I'll do is I'll aim for about 45 minutes to an hour's worth of recording. And my 3.5 hour discussion on Homer's Iliad is the very rare exception. But even there, I still spent weeks trying to ensure that every single minute of it was packed with the kind of depth that was in no way any kind of a waste of your time listening. And so I was really pleased when that particular recording received such a good reception from its listeners. And the important thing to keep in mind about that recording on the Iliad is that its primary theme was the shield of Achilles. And the reason I did that was because I placed it in my Technology and Nihilism series that I'm doing on my Athens Corner website. And the reason for that is that the argument that I make in that recording is that there absolutely is a teaching in Homer on this thing that we call technology today. The Greek word is simply techne, which means art, craftsmanship, artisanship, etc. And so while the ultimate goal of that particular series is an exploration of what we find, for instance, in the thought of Martin Heidegger and a few other 20th century philosophers on what is easily recognizable as our problems with technology. And so what I'm showing in that series, by beginning with the earliest of the pre-moderns, like the opening of Genesis, Homer, Thucydides, etc., is that we fool ourselves if we think that our particular problems with technology are unique to us and don't have a very significant precedence in much earlier thinkers, and in particular in the foundational thinkers of the West. And that brings us to this recording on Thucydides, because it turns out that Thucydides has an enormous amount to teach us about everything which tumbles out from this combination of technology, and what we understand as progress in combination with the political life of man. And what's particularly important about Thucydides is that he provides a fundamental alternative to the two other thinkers who have long been recognized as the primary thinkers at the origin of Western civilization, namely Plato and Aristotle. And I'm going to go into great detail in this discussion about why that's the case. But let me be very clear about it here from the beginning in two ways. The first being what Nietzsche has to say about Thucydides, and the second being my own interpretation that also takes into account what Nietzsche might mean with regard to his own understanding of Thucydides. And so what I have in mind in particular with what Nietzsche has to say about Thucydides comes from Twilight of the Idols, and it's in the section entitled What I Owe the Ancients. And let me emphasize, I'm not necessarily endorsing this interpretation, but it's extremely important because Nietzsche himself has recognized in Thucydides a fundamental alternative to the tradition going back to Plato. And one of the reasons that that is so significant is that what it means is that in order for us to understand Nietzsche, and it is absolutely important that we understand Nietzsche because he's been so influential, but what Nietzsche is about to tell us is that for us to be able to truly understand him, we need to understand Thucydides. But let me emphasize that simply because I'm beginning with this example of Thucydides and Nietzsche, it could very well be the case that Nietzsche's Thucydides is not Thucydides. And so what I'm saying is that this entire discussion is not fundamentally indebted to Nietzsche or Thucydides read through the lens of Nietzsche. That's not what's going on here. I'm simply emphasizing the importance of Thucydides for as enormously influential a philosopher as Nietzsche. And you're going to immediately recognize why I have to provide that kind of qualification about Nietzsche on Thucydides, because of how amazingly inflammatory Nietzsche is regarding Thucydides. Nietzsche comes out swinging, and it's immediately obvious why the full title of the text is Twilight of the Idols, or How to Philosophize with a Hammer, because Nietzsche is about to take a hammer to Plato, to Christians, to the very belief in something called the good, to idealism, to the Jews, and to the whole phenomenon of what we would otherwise call morality in the Western tradition. And he's going to do it in the name of Thucydides. And this is what he says. In the end, I have a deep distrust of Plato. I find him so much at odds with the basic Hellenic instincts, so moralistic, so proleptically Christian, he already has good as the highest concept, that I would just as soon refer to the whole Plato phenomena in harsh terms, like higher hoax, or, if you would prefer, idealism, than in any other way. We have paid a high price for the fact that this Athenian went to school with Egyptians, or with Jews in Egypt, I don't know. In the great disaster of Christianity, Plato represents that ambiguity and fascination called an ideal that made it possible for the nobler natures of antiquity to misunderstand themselves and to step out onto the bridge that leads to the cross. And how much Plato there still is in the concept of church and the structure, system, and practice of the church. My vacation, my preference, my cure for all things Platonic has always been Thucydides. Thucydides and perhaps Machiavelli's Prince. These are most closely related to me in terms of their unconditional will not to be fooled and to see reason in reality, not in reason, and even less in morality. Thucydides is the best cure for the classically educated young man who has carried away a horrible, whitewashed image of the ideal Greeks as the reward for his secondary school training. You have to turn Thucydides over, line by line, and read his ulterior motives as clearly as his words. There are few thinkers with so many ulterior motives. He represents the most perfect expression of the sophists' culture, by which I mean the realists' culture. This invaluable movement, right in the middle of the hoax of morals and ideals that was being perpetrated on all sides by the Socratic schools. Greek philosophy as the decadence of the Greek instinct. Thucydides as the great summation, the final manifestation of that strong, severe, harsh objectivity that lay in the instincts of the more ancient Hellenes. In the end, what divides natures like Thucydides from natures like Plato is courage in the face of reality. Plato is a coward in the face of reality. Consequently, he escapes into the ideal. Thucydides has self-control, and consequently, he has control over things as well. Okay, there is an enormous amount being said in those passages. In fact, it's nothing less than a rethinking of the entire Western philosophical tradition, and understanding all the claims and the premises of the claims that come tumbling out from just that is why I'm doing an entire series on Nietzsche's masterpiece, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But for our purposes here, it's clear. One of the greatest postmodern philosophers, Nietzsche, is telling us that Thucydides represents a fundamental alternative to Plato. And in fact, Thucydides represents a cure, as Nietzsche says, for those people today who have been educated in a so-called classical education, which, according to Nietzsche, is misguided by the privileging of Plato and the Platonic tradition instead of Thucydides. And notice what he says further about Thucydides, that you have to turn him over line by line to understand what his ulterior motives are, as opposed to merely what his words are. Now that's a very powerful claim, especially coming from a philologist like Nietzsche, who absolutely specialized in languages and words in particular. So he's telling us that we need to be on our guard and read very carefully, which is to say not casually, as we're reading Thucydides. Now further, what Nietzsche claims there is that Thucydides is the culmination of the non-decadent Greek instincts of the more ancient Hellenes or Greeks that gets replaced and left behind by the decadence of what Nietzsche says is Greek philosophy. So he's clearly talking about Plato and the Platonic tradition there. Now, that means something very specific for Nietzsche, but for us in particular, what that means is that there's something that we could call Greekness to the Greeks, which is to say something very unique that separates them from all other peoples. That's going to be enormously important for us as we read through the opening paragraphs of Thucydides. And lastly, what I'll say is this. Nietzsche closes that passage by noting that what separates Thucydides from Plato or the Platonic tradition is some kind of self-control, or what we might think of as prudence. And it's precisely that self-control that gives one control. Another way to phrase that is that Nietzsche is telling us that a careful and meticulous reading of Thucydides provides us here and now with some kind of teaching of politics that is extremely relevant if it is the case that one seeks power. Now, there's an enormous amount more that can be said about all of that with regard to Nietzsche. And again, that's exactly why I'm doing the entire series on Nietzsche's masterpiece, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But here the point is that we have an enormously influential precedence in very recent philosophy, namely with Nietzsche, that is telling us, instructing us, that the very careful, meticulous, and thoughtful reading of Thucydides is absolutely not some mere antiquarian activity. In fact, it's quite the opposite. We are being told by a first-rate philosopher that there is a teaching in Thucydides that constitutes not only an alternative to the entire Western philosophical tradition, and is so importantly relevant for us that it could cure the problem of the most vulgar nihilism that Nietzsche has diagnosed as our terminal illness. So just think about that. Nietzsche, the teacher of the Overman, and the problem of the meaning of the claim that God is dead, is holding up Thucydides very explicitly to us and saying, this is what helped me to overcome the entire tradition of Platonism. And if you too learn from him, Thucydides, then he can teach you not only also how to overcome the entire tradition of Platonism, but also how to gain the reins of power. And what's most amazing about that is that of all the other people that Nietzsche could have included there, he says Machiavelli's Prince is the only other thing that might come in second place in comparison to Thucydides. But okay, I'll leave it at that with Nietzsche and give a very tentative, brief summary of what I'll spend the next few hours talking about that's available to us precisely through a very careful, meticulous, thoughtful reading of the opening few paragraphs of Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. So the very first thing that we have to reckon with concerns our own baggage that we bring with us to the text. And what I mean by that is our particular concepts regarding the various fields of inquiry, namely literature, philosophy, history. What are we dealing with here? And in the case of Thucydides, this is extremely problematic because for a long time, even the very title of the text has been corrupted. It's usually thought of as Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, and the text itself has no title, and so that title is usually taken from the opening line of the text. And I'll cover this in great detail in the subsequent discussion here, but suffice it to say, the word history is not, and I place emphasis on not, in the opening sentence. So the text is not to be understood as the history of the Peloponnesian War. It is simply the Peloponnesian War. And that makes all the difference in the world, because Thucydides does not understand himself and does not want to be understood as merely providing a record of the chronological events of the Peloponnesian War. That is not how he wants to be understood. And he's perfectly and explicitly clear about this, not only in the opening paragraph, but throughout the text itself. And again, I'm going to go into this in great detail in the subsequent discussion, but as a brief and quick entry into what this means here, it's very helpful for us to recognize that kind of baggage, in other words, the conceptualization of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides, as merely history on our part through the lens of something that Aristotle has to say in the Poetics. In other words, taking a look at what Aristotle has to say in the Poetics helps us enormously in recognizing what Thucydides understands himself as providing us with. And what I mean by that is the following. In the 9th section of Aristotle's Poetics, Aristotle uses philosophy as the standard by which to distinguish between history and poetry. Now, the fact that he uses philosophy as the standard is itself worthy of its own discussion. But leaving that aside, I'll simply read what Aristotle has to say here, and you'll immediately recognize why I'm emphasizing Aristotle as helpful in better recognizing what we might mistakenly bring with ourselves to Thucydides that causes us to misunderstand Thucydides as merely history. So this is what Aristotle says. It's not the task of the poet to speak of what has come to be, but rather to speak of what sort of things would come to be. In other words, of what is possible according to the likely or the necessary. So, a sidebar real quickly. What he's saying is that poetry does not provide history. Rather, poetry provides that which is possible based upon that which is likely or necessary. And then continuing, he says, for the historian and the poet do not differ by speaking either in meters or without meters, because if that were simply the case, it would be possible for the writings of Herodotus to be put in meters, and they would no less be a history with meter than without meter. Rather, they differ in this. The one speaks of what has come to be, while the other speaks of what sort would come to be. Therefore, poetry is more philosophic and of more stature than history, for poetry speaks rather of the general things, while history speaks of the particular things. Okay, so this is, according to Aristotle, the philosophical difference between poetry and history. Namely, history speaks of what has come to be, and that's to say that history deals with the particular. And in contrast to that, poetry speaks of what could come to be based upon either the likely or the necessary. And so what that means is that poetry speaks about the universal. So, history speaks of the particular, poetry speaks of the universal. What we have here is a hierarchy of the fundamental concepts that describe fields of inquiry, namely philosophy, poetry, and history. And what distinguishes them is the extent to which they're dependent upon unique characteristics, which we refer to as particulars, or characteristics that are not unique and they simply endure. Well, unique and endure through what? Through time. So temporality, or time itself, is fundamental to these distinctions that are being made for these fundamental concepts that we casually use the words philosophy, poetry, or history to describe. Now, the reason that's worth keeping in mind is because what comes along with our baggage of this concept called history today are various philosophies of history. And I'm going to have a lot to say about that in this discussion subsequently, but I just want to make a note of that here. So just to clarify, the characteristic of uniqueness, of particularity, is thoroughly dependent upon time or temporality, whereas the characteristic of a universal is not dependent upon time or temporality. And always remember, the purpose of my entire series here on technology and nihilism is to lead us into the thought of Martin Heidegger. And for Heidegger, what we're going to see is that such fundamental distinctions based upon temporality can no longer be made at all. And that's going to be a sort of culmination of the various philosophies of history that begin to emerge, roughly around the late 18th century, going all the way into the 20th century. So I just want you to keep that in mind here, because it's that view to the end of what the purpose of this whole series is that makes it necessary for us to belabor some of these otherwise very subtle details that might seem very strange or out of place here. But concerning those subtleties here, what we have is a hierarchy. Philosophy is the highest, precisely because it's the standard by which the other two are to be judged. And underneath philosophy, you have poetry, and then underneath poetry, you have history. Now keep in mind, I'm not saying that this is the final word on any kind of hierarchy with regard to these concepts. I'm simply saying that this is helpful for us in better understanding Thucydides. And so again, according to Aristotle, the historian stays within the particular, while the poet deals with the universal. But as we're going to see, even in the opening paragraph of Thucydides, he's going to claim to have found within the particular of the Peloponnesian War a universal. But according to Aristotle's hierarchy here, the only thing that deals with both the particulars and the universals is philosophy. But Thucydides is not doing philosophy, at least according to Aristotle's partitioning here of these things. So our question is this: how does Thucydides transcend the particular of the Peloponnesian War in order to grasp, as he's going to claim, a universal without himself being philosophical? And another way to phrase that is that Thucydides claims to present with his text, the Peloponnesian War, a universal within the particular. And this is where things become very fascinating, because at least according to what Aristotle has to say in the Poetics, for Thucydides to present a universal from within the particular, Thucydides is closely aligned with the tragic poet. And it's precisely because what Thucydides is doing, as Aristotle says of the tragic poet, the putting together of events, which is to say, story. And story, according to Aristotle, for tragedy, is the first arche, or principle, or source that operates, as Aristotle says, like the soul of tragedy. And moreover, tragedy itself guides the soul of man. Now, the way that he's going to go on further to say how it is that tragedy guides the soul of man is going to unfold into an amazing definition of the beautiful. And let me just simply add here, as possibly one of the most important sidebars I've ever made in any discussion, the relevance of Nietzsche at this point regarding Aristotle for understanding Thucydides with respect to poetry, and in particular tragedy, is absolutely crucial for understanding Nietzsche. Because never forget that Nietzsche is fundamentally concerned with poetry and in particular tragedy. And so what I'm suggesting here is that in Nietzsche's recognition of Thucydides as an alternative to the Platonic tradition of the entirety of philosophy in the West, could very well hinge on this recognition of Thucydides being closer to a tragic poet than a philosopher in the sense that comes down to us through the Platonic tradition that Nietzsche seeks an alternative to. And in fact, it's very tempting to want to explore the possibility that what Nietzsche refers to as the music-making Socrates that's needed to correct for the historical Socrates might very well be Thucydides. But all of that is for a separate discussion on Aristotle's Poetics. For our purposes here, it's simply enough for us to put these things on the table and say, okay, Thucydides is not providing philosophy according to Aristotle, but what he is providing seems to be very similar to tragedy, and tragedy offers this amazing capacity to guide the soul of man according to the beautiful. And again, I'm going to go into all of this in great detail in the subsequent discussion here, so we can leave it at that for now, and I'll simply say very tentatively and admittedly provocatively that the universal Thucydides is going to present to us from the particular of the Peloponnesian War that would seemingly have the capacity to guide the human soul is, in fact, a teaching about the human soul, namely, that mind shows itself most especially in the form of techne or technology, amid rare moments of rest or peace, in the ceaseless flux that is all the human things. But it is of the very nature of soul, in such displays of mind, to become daring. And it's precisely in that daring that mind, in the form of techne, undermines the very condition of peace or rest for its own flourishing, and in so doing invites the universal flux of all the human things and the political things to flood in over it in the form of war. Now keep in mind, that's a very condensed summary of an extremely subtle teaching from the entirety of Thucydides, and all of the complicated subtleties in that summary have to be demonstrated persuasively through a very careful reading. And this discussion is going to go a long way in providing that kind of persuasive reading. But what's most important immediately is that you see with Thucydides, there's nothing of the kind of baggage that we have today from all the various philosophies of history. Those are very new in the Western philosophical tradition. Instead, what we have with Thucydides is a very subtle teaching on human psychology. And it's that teaching on human psychology that constitutes the universal, that's always and everywhere the same for man. And the Peloponnesian War is simply the particular occasion in which Thucydides is going to claim that it is most on display and visible for all to see. So again, and to emphasize, we do not have a philosophy of history with Thucydides. We have an account of human psychology. And what's most amazing about that account of human psychology is that it emphasizes the role of mind revealing itself by way of techne, or technology. And so what we have with Thucydides' Peloponnesian War is the fundamental question of whether or not the power of mind to master the ceaseless flux of universal motions, whether political or natural, which is simply to say whether of human making or non-human making, can be enduring, because wise statesmanship is itself an art. Now again, let me emphasize, I'm going to spend the next few hours explaining in great detail exactly what I mean by all of that, so just bear with me if it didn't make any sense or seemed absurd. But let me just emphasize here that the privileging of these universal motions, ceaseless flux, by Thucydides, in order to best understand human nature, gets us exactly to the fundamental difference between Thucydides on the one hand and then Plato and Aristotle on the other hand. And I'll explain that too in the subsequent discussion here. So I really hope you stay with me on this, because I think you're going to find it really fascinating. And my hope is always that you find it fascinating enough to take a look at my Athens Corner website and consider becoming a subscriber, because I'm able to provide so much more content like this there that I'm able to provide in very long format form here on the various podcast outlets. And with that said, now let's begin this journey. All right, so we are in the third discussion of Thucydides in my Technology and Nihilism series. The entirety of the first discussion was devoted to just the opening paragraph of the text, and similarly, the entirety of the second discussion was devoted to just the second paragraph of the text. And I won't reinvent the wheel because they're on my Athens Corner website, but suffice it to say that we had to go so slow because it takes a very meticulous reading for us to recognize that Thucydides is not providing us with mere history. And as we saw, the word history is not even in the opening sentence that the text is named after. So it's not Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. No, it's simply the Peloponnesian War. And the reason that this is so important is that for Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War is just one particular from which he has found a universal. And that universal concerns the nature of man at his highest in comparison to merely the barbarians, and what can be known of man at that height when he is placed in motion. And that's the import of the Peloponnesian War for Thucydides this far. The Athenians and the Spartans are, as he says, at their height, their greatest readiness for war. But to be at the height of readiness for war means that you're at the height of what you achieve in peace. And so it's that moment, that height, that makes the particular of the Peloponnesian War so very important because on the one hand, it's representative of the achievement of the mind at peace, while at the same time, it's precisely that moment of standing on the precipice between war and peace when a people is at their best that they become daring. And that's what makes Thucydides unique, because it is from within his telling of the Peloponnesian War that this combination of mind and daring provides Thucydides this amazing vantage point to recognize human psychology that applies at all times. That's the universal. And it's thoroughly bound up with the two things that we recognize today as, on the one hand, progress, and on the other hand, technology. We're really going to see that come out in this discussion, but suffice it to say here that what this means for Thucydides is that if you really want to know what human beings are like, which is to say if you really want to know and understand human nature, then you don't look at man in terms of rest and peace. You look at man in terms of war. That's where human nature shows itself the most. Now, that in itself is going to distinguish Thucydides from Plato and Aristotle, as Thucydides is going to tell us much later in Book 3, in his own name, which is very rare for Thucydides, and we'll get to that in this discussion as well. But what he says in Book 3 is that civil strife inflicted many a terrible blow on the cities, as always does, and always will happen, while human nature remains what it is, though the degree and kind of the damage may vary in each case according to the particular circumstances. In times of peace and prosperity, cities and individuals alike show better judgment because they do not fall prey to forces beyond their control. But war is a violent master. It robs us of the means of providing easily for our daily life and needs, and it usually generates passions to match our circumstances. And there you really have it, because notice what he says there. If war robs us of the means of providing easily for our daily life and needs, what that means is that war robs us of what mind provides for us in times of peace. And moreover, war generates, as he says, passions to match our circumstances. And so if all you know of man is how he easily provides for himself in his daily life through mind, you don't know man, because the whole of man is far more than what man is in easily providing for his daily needs. The whole of man will include all of those passions that are generated in him when he's robbed of the ability to easily provide for those needs. And that's to say that if you want to truly know man, then you simply have to come to know man under the violent instruction of war. And let me include a little sidebar here, because very related to that quote that I just provided from Thucydides in Book 3 is something that's going to be extremely important in our subsequent discussion about the transition from modernity to postmodernity concerning this topic of technology and nihilism. And what I mean by that is the following. A very similar claim is going to be made about reason itself, and it's going to be in a rather similar context with regard to temporality. But let me be more specific. The claim that's going to be made is that in the process of evolution, human reason itself is something new under the sun for human beings. And as man cultivates that thing, reason, it generates in him more passions. And so the temporality of mind itself becomes extremely problematic for the equilibrium of man's desires. Or more simply put, as man creates more technology, man cannot help but also create more passions for that technology, the pleasures, etc., that get associated with the technology. And so the temporality of mind is going to become a fundamental problem of human being as such, because this thing we call progress with regard to technology, always advancing as it is, means that man's equilibrium with himself, and that's simply a fancy way of saying what man desires versus what he's able to acquire or achieve. is always unstable and often extremely unstable because through technology, man creates the very situation that makes it impossible for him to ever be satisfied with what he has. That's going to be Rousseau's fundamental critique of the Enlightenment. And it's going to turn out that Kant is so moved by this criticism, just as much, if not more so, than he's moved by what Hume says about the notion of causality being problematic, that very, very much of what we understand as Kant's critiques are absolutely in response to Rousseau and this problem of technology. And amazingly, Kant's solution to this is going to be nothing less than this thing that we refer to as culture. And so you see, so very much is going to come tumbling out of this. And we see it here right before our eyes with Thucydides. And so that's what I mean when I say that Thucydides is not providing us with mere history. He has found something universal about human nature from within the particular of the Peloponnesian War. And that's the purpose of the Peloponnesian War, to get that teaching across. Not so much this business about Athens versus Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. Those are just the particulars. The universal is the very nature of man, or more specifically, the nature of man as it shows itself through this thing that we today recognize as progress, which, as we're going to see, shows itself most especially through techne, or art. And that's going to be what we recognize today as technology. But that's just a glimpse at what's coming. And so for our purposes here, again, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel concerning the first paragraph and the second paragraph of the text, because I have entire discussions on my Athens Corner website about those. But I will quickly read through them now as we go into where we left off at the end of the second discussion. And so just to get us caught up here, this is what we have. The text begins as follows. Thucydides of Athens wrote the war of the Peloponnesians and the Athenians, how they waged it against each other. So again, no word for history there. He began writing at its very outset, in the expectation that this would be a great war and more worthy of account than any previous one. He based this judgment on the grounds that both sides came into the war at the height of their powers and in a full state of military readiness. And he also saw that the rest of the Greek world had either taken sides right at the start or was now planning to do so. This was certainly the greatest ever upheaval, or motion, that's the Greek word there, stasis, among the Greeks. So, what began as a war has now spiraled into something much larger, more conceptual, this thing he calls a motion, an upheaval. And not only that, but it's the greatest thing that has ever happened among the Greeks. And then he continues by saying, and it was one which affected a good part of the barbarian world too, even, you could say, most of mankind. So, the Peloponnesian War does not involve all the peoples of the world, and yet it affects all the peoples of the world. Continuing, he says, in respect of the preceding period and the still more remote past, the length of time that has elapsed made it impossible to ascertain clearly what happened. But from the evidence I find, I can trust in pushing my inquiries back as far as possible. I judge that earlier events were not on the same scale, either as regards their wars or in other respects. Now that last sentence there was very interesting, because he's talked about the historical evidence, and then he himself has made a judgment. But he hasn't told us what the standard is by which he makes that judgment. And so we need to hang a question mark over precisely what the criteria is that he's using to make this judgment, because it's going to turn out at the very end of the archaeology here, what he has to say about that is amazing. But in any case, that is the first paragraph. Now again, I have an entire discussion about that first paragraph because there's so much that we can glean from that. But ultimately, what's at issue, and we see it there in that last sentence, is that there is a claim to greatness. Something about the Peloponnesian War is greater than any event that has ever happened among the Greeks. And further, it's so great that even though it only includes certain peoples, it affects the entirety of the world. And so that's going to be that universal claim that Thucydides has gleaned from this particular event of the Peloponnesian War. And like I discussed at length previously, what we have in that opening paragraph is a breakdown of what we could think of as human types. You have the human beings in general, and then from human beings, you have on the one hand Greekness, and on the other hand barbarians. And then within the category of Greekness, you have two types. You have the Athenians and you have the Spartans. And so in that respect, for Thucydides, at least at this point, it appears to be the case that Spartans and Athenians are representative of human beings at their best. And most importantly, about the Athenians and the Spartans is that they are not the same. There would seem to be at least something about them that is antithetical. They are two separate groups, two separate types. In other words, Greekness, whatever that is cohesive enough to encompass both the Athenians and the Spartans. However, it's also diverse enough such that these two types, the Athenian type and the Spartan type, could very well be antithetical within that category of Greekness. And especially keep in mind, Thucydides has gone out of his way in the opening sentence of that paragraph, which is to say the opening sentence of the entire text, to say that he is an Athenian. He's not a Spartan. And we're going to find out that that is absolutely definitive of everything that we're going to find of substance for our topic here in the Technology and Nihilism series with Thucydides. But that being said, our curiosity at this point is piqued because on the one hand, we want to know what separates barbarism from Greekness. And further, within Greekness, we want to know what separates the Spartans from the Athenians. And the archaeology itself, and remember, the archaeology just refers to those first 20 or so paragraphs of the opening of the text. But it's those questions, the difference between barbarism and Greekness, and then the difference between Athens and Sparta, that the archaeology itself is going to clarify for us, presumably. And so that's what we have in mind as we go into the second paragraph now. And so beginning, Thucydides says the following: "It's evident that long ago what is now called Hellas had no stable settlements. Instead, there were various migrations in these early times, and each group readily abandoned their own territory whenever forced to do so by those with superior numbers. For there was no commerce, and people were insecure about making contact with each other, either by land or sea, so that each lived off their own land, just at the subsistence level, and neither produced any surplus goods nor planted the ground, since they had no walls, and never knew when some invader might come and rob them. They took the view that they could secure their daily needs for sustenance anywhere, and so they were not concerned about uprooting and moving on, with the consequences that they had no cities of any size or other general resources to make them strong. It was always the finest land that was most subject to changes of population, namely, what is now called Thessaly, Boeotia, most of the Peloponnese, excluding Arcadia, and the best parts elsewhere. And the quality of the land gave some groups more power than others, and that led to internal conflict. Now, the Greek word that's used there is stasis, and so we need to keep in mind that that's the exact same word that gets used in the opening paragraph, where war quickly was transformed into this thing called stasis, a much broader category, motion. So what Thucydides has just told us is that at the most basic level of property, land, there's an associated quest for power, and it's that associated quest for power that leads to stasis, motion. In continuing, he says it's that motion that destroyed them and at the same time encouraged outsiders to have designs on them. Attica, at any rate, has been free of such strife from the earliest times on account of its poor soil, and it's always been inhabited by the same people. This is a good illustration of my argument that it was because of relocations that other places did not develop in the same way as Attica. For the most powerful figures from other parts of Greece who were driven out either by war or internal conflict, stasis, motion, resorted to the safety of Athens, and by becoming citizens right from the very earliest times, they so increased the city's population that Attica could not contain them, and the Athenians later sent out colonies to occupy Ionia as well. All right, and that is the second paragraph of the text. And just let me remind you, I've done an entire discussion just on teasing out everything that comes tumbling from a close examination of that paragraph. And again, that's on my Athens Corner website. But since we're just catching up here, I'll mention just a few of the important things that are involved in that paragraph. Notice the way he ends that paragraph. He says, "This is a good illustration of my argument." Okay, pause. What's his argument? Well, in the rest of that sentence, he says that it was because of the relocations that other places did not develop in the same way as Attica. So we ask ourselves, wait a minute, where did he make that argument? And when you look back at the opening of the paragraph, it's right there. He said it's evident that long ago what is now called Hellas had no stable settlements. In other words, what's called Hellas didn't exist. It's only now called Hellas. And continuing that sentence, he says, instead, in other words, instead of a stable Hellas, which means any Hellas, there were various migrations in these early times. And so this is a perfect example of what we could call the matchstick theory of reading. You find a little piece here, and then you find a little piece there, and then you rub them together, and it bursts out into a flame. And in our case here, what we see is that what Thucydides is calling his argument is that from the earliest times, there was no stability. There was only motions. Motions in terms of migrations, groups of people, wandering, roaming, nothing stable, a kind of fundamental flux. And he's very explicit. He tells us what the reason is for this instability, this flux, these motions. The first is superior numbers. And what that means is what is now called Hellas was populated by small groups of people, none of whom were committed to any particular land or area because they would simply flee whenever they were outnumbered. And because of this, there was no commerce, no trade. He says people were flatly afraid of contact with each other, either by land or sea. And the consequence of this is that people only lived at the level of daily subsistence, producing no surplus, and so no plans for the future, and certainly no agriculture, no planting of the ground, because it's precisely the ground that they were going to flee whenever outnumbered. And so they certainly didn't have any walls, no defenses against these larger groups of people, of whom they never know when they would be attacked. So no planning, no thought whatsoever about the future except fleeing. And so what we have in all of this from Thucydides is something like the following kind of a checklist. The earliest times of what they now call Hellas, which previously was nothing but small groups of people who would always just flee whenever they were outnumbered, is definitively characterized by war, unrest, motion, poverty because of no commerce, and outright injustice. And so the antitheses of these characteristics are peace, rest, wealth, right, or justice. And we see those things begin to emerge with Attica, which is to say Athens. The land of Athens was so poor that no one really wanted it, and so the earliest inhabitants never had to flee anybody. Nobody wanted their land. But because of all the motions, the stasis, all over the rest of what is now called Hellas, the greatest men of those roving groups that were just simply fleeing all end up in Athens. And so the population of Athens swells so much that they're able to send out people and establish colonies. In other words, Athens becomes a kind of empire. And what Thucydides is telling us is that what is now called Hellas seems to owe its greatness to the initial emergence of Athens. And again, what characterizes Athens of all the rest of what is now called Hellas or Greece is that it was not affected by the motions, the stasis. In other words, while all the rest of the peoples that were simply roving the earliest times of Greece, Athens was not subject to that. And so amid the fact that it was at rest, not in motion, not in stasis, what emerges is peace, wealth, and right and justice for them as a people. And so according to the earliest times, What Thucydides is telling us is that while everything is in motion, flux, unstable, fundamentally lacking greatness, the possibility for founding a people as a people emerges for Thucydides with the example of Athens. And we can phrase that alternatively as follows. If it is the case that all is in motion, there is a fundamental flux and instability, chance, that characterizes the life of man, and particularly the life of man in political community, then the possibility of wise statesmanship under such conditions emerges in these rare pockets that lack motion and therefore allow for the possibility of greatness, which for Thucydides, at least based on this paragraph, would seem to be characterized by strength, large numbers of people, walls, commerce, agriculture. And so you see the pattern here. This is techne, art, what we think of as technology. And what Thucydides is telling us is that Athens is a textbook example of how this kind of greatness can come into being. And regarding that greatness, again, to emphasize, characterized by techne, the arts, and that's to say, the mind of man, under such conditions of fundamental flux, fundamental motion, fundamental chance, Athens serves as an example, as the example, according to Thucydides here, of that kind of greatness. And one last thing to add about that second paragraph, because remember, again, I've done an entire recording just on that paragraph and everything that comes tumbling out of it on my Athens Corner website. But suffice it to say here that Thucydides is talking about, as he explicitly says, the earliest times. And what do we know is most characteristic of the earliest times? It's the divine, the gods. The reason we say that the old is the good is because the oldest of all the old is the gods. And so you see that Thucydides is going to have nothing to do with that, as a matter of principle, apparently. And this is going to distinguish Thucydides again from Plato and Aristotle, because in Plato and Aristotle, what you always have is that the fundamental principle of all politics is that the old is the good, precisely because the old is where the divine is to be found. Now, they, of course, have their own teachings about the divine and can in no way be said to be orthodox whatsoever. Nonetheless, they still treat the divine very, very prudently. And Thucydides, while he does have a teaching on prudence, it's very, very different than from what we find in Plato and Aristotle. So again, we see that Thucydides shows himself as an alternative, a fundamental alternative to the other defining legacies in the Western tradition, namely Plato and Aristotle. And keep in mind, our theme here is technology and nihilism. And so the status of the divine in relationship to techne, or the art, or man applying his mind, is everything. And here we are, just in the second paragraph of this text, and all of that has come tumbling out already. And Thucydides is even going to begin the next paragraph by emphasizing a justification of what he had just said was his argument. He says the following: a strong indication of the weakness of ancient peoples is this. Okay, again, full stop. Remember that in the previous paragraph, his argument was that there was no Hellas, there was no Greece. There were just small groups of roving peoples characterized by what they were lacking, namely any kind of greatness that comes from techne, art, what we think of as technology. And what he's explicitly saying now is that that was weakness. Those were merely, as he says, ancient peoples. You couldn't call them Greeks because he's saying that Greece didn't even exist. And so what we're on the precipice here of discovering is what constitutes Greekness as opposed from barbarism. Because if the ancient peoples weren't even Greeks, what would they have had to have been? Barbarians. And so whereas the barbarians are characterized by fundamental weakness, the Greeks, according to Thucydides, are going to fundamentally be characterized by a kind of strength. And we should have every anticipation that that strength is going to come fundamentally from the power of mind to correct or redress all those weaknesses that the earliest peoples of Greece did not have. And so remember, from that second paragraph, what they did not have fundamentally was any kind of territorial stability because they lacked great numbers, they lacked defensive walls, they lacked agriculture, and so certainly they lacked exchange. They had no commerce, no trade, and they were flatly afraid of contact with other groups, either by land or sea. And it's that reference to the sea that's going to prove definitive, because what characterizes strength upon the sea is a navy. And what is most important for a navy is the technology available to them in order to project that strength on the sea. But we simply anticipate that that's coming at this point. Continuing, Thucydides says the following: before the time of the Trojan War, Greece appears not to have united in any common action. Indeed, as far as I know, there was as yet no name for the country of Hellas as a whole. But before the time of Hellen, son of Deucalion, so keep in mind here, this is Hellen, son of Deucalion, not Helen of Troy. But before the time of Hellen, son of Deucalion, that actual appellation, in other words, the name of Hellas or Hellenes, did not even exist, and different places took their names instead from the various tribes, predominantly the Pelasgians. However, when Hellen and his sons became powerful in Pythiotis and were called in to help other cities, one by one, these now tended to be called Hellenes by association, though it was a long time before that name prevailed among them all. Homer provides the best evidence for this. Though born much later even than the Trojan War, he, Homer, never uses this name. In other words, Homer never uses the word Hellas for Greece or Hellenes to refer to them all collectively, nor to any of them separately, except for the followers of Achilles from Pythiotis, who were in fact the first Hellenes. Instead, he, Homer, calls them Danaans, Argives, and Achaeans in his poems. And so what we're witnessing right here is Thucydides employing a kind of philology or analysis by words to contest the authority of Homer. So let's be perfectly clear here. Thucydides is challenging Homer with regard to the traditional understanding of the origins of Greece. And also keep in mind that because Thucydides had casually mentioned that Homer lived long after the Trojan War, Thucydides is flatly challenging Homer simply. And what I mean by that is that he's challenging Homer on the origins of the greatness of the Greeks. And so Thucydides is offering an alternative here, as in some way better. We don't know what all's entailed in that yet, but that certainly is the thrust of his argument in engaging Homer in this way. In continuing, he says, moreover, he, Homer, does not ever speak of barbarians either, in my view, because the Hellenes had not yet been identified by some contrasting name. And so there you have it. There was no Greekness yet, nothing to distinguish the early peoples of Greece from the barbarians. And Thucydides is using as proof the fact that Homer never uses the word barbarians or Hellenes. In other words, there was no fundamental distinction. And continuing, he says, these various Hellenes, then, whether they acquired the name one by one, as they came to understand the same language, or were later called that collectively, because of their individual weakness and their lack of contact with each other, they failed to achieve anything together before the Trojan War. And they only came together for this expedition. In other words, they only came together for the Trojan War because they were by then becoming more experienced seafarers. All right, so that's the end of the third paragraph, but notice the enormity of the claim being made there. Thucydides is saying that the real cause of the Trojan War is not what Homer says it is. It has nothing to do with Helen of Troy. Thucydides is saying instead that the Trojan War was merely the result of the earliest of the Greeks, who had only slowly begun to even speak the same language, becoming better seafarers. Now think about what that means. Presumably, becoming more experienced at seafaring means that you are getting better at navigating the sea and, presumably, improving the kind of ships that you use in that navigation. Becoming better at seafaring means that you are becoming better at techne, and it's exactly that that Thucydides says is the true source of the Trojan War. And to be the true source of the Trojan War means to be the true source of the greatness that is characteristic and defines Greekness. And so what Thucydides is telling us here is that the origin of Greekness, the origin of Greek greatness, all that distinguishes them from the barbarians, is improvement with techne, what we would think of as technological innovation. It is not a cuckolded Menelaus, which is to say a Helen seduced by Paris. But what ends up being most amazing about this is that there's every bit as much eros, or this longing, in Thucydides' account as there was eros in Homer. The difference, though, is going to be that in Thucydides, the greater eros, the more definitive eros in the soul of man, is that which is writ large across the entire people. And later in the text, he's going to famously say, in his own name, that Athens had an eros as a people for Sicily that ultimately ruins them. But we're going to find out more about this shortly, because Thucydides is not going to leave it at just that. But just think of the enormity of everything that's in that third paragraph. People often draw comparisons and say that Homer is the Bible for the Greeks. And so if that's the case, and there is a good argument to be made that that was the case, Thucydides claims to be debunking all of that. But let's continue into the fourth paragraph now, because notice how these paragraphs seem to follow one upon the other. They're absolutely written as a kind of ongoing argument. Each one follows the previous one. And this is simply to say that there is some kind of a structure to Thucydides' argument, and we can never lose sight of the fact of what that argument is. As we've seen, Thucydides' argument is that the possibility of wise statesmanship that results in greatness amid the ceaseless chance motions, or stasis, of man in political community, such wisdom amid chance is in some way fundamentally defined by or characterized by the power of mind as it shows itself through techne, or what we would call technological development, advancement. And just to really bring out this great difference there is between, on the one hand, the individual eros that we see in Homer, and so, for instance, the eros for a loved one, or the eros for individual glory, versus what we're going to see in Thucydides, where that kind of individual eros becomes so fashionable that it gets writ large across the entirety of a people. And so we can genuinely speak of political eros, precisely because that distinction, in other words, individual eros versus political eros, is what distinguishes Homer from Thucydides. Let me just simply read that passage. What has happened in the text is that Alcibiades has whipped the Athenian people into such a frenzy to desire Sicily that Nicias, the other commander who's advising against this expedition, realizes he simply can't even convince the Athenians that it's a bad idea, and so he attempts to argue that they simply don't have the resources for such a massive expedition. This is what Thucydides, in his own name, again, a rarity for Thucydides. He rarely inserts his own thoughts or opinions about things, and we're going to see why later in this discussion. But Thucydides says the following: Nicias said all this, thinking that he would thereby deter the Athenians by the magnitude of the task he was presenting, or, if he were forced to undertake the expedition, that they would on this basis at least be sailing out with the maximum security. The Athenians, however, were not to be shaken from their passionate desire for the expedition by the prospect of these burdensome preparations. Now, the word translated there as passionate desire, that's epithumia. Plato's Socrates in the Republic is going to use that same word to describe part of the soul in his tripartition of the soul. But not even that rises to the level of eros, because that's what's coming next. Continuing, Thucydides, in his own name, says, in fact, they, the Athenians, were all the more motivated, and the result was just the opposite of what he, Nicias, had expected. They, the Athenians, thought that he, Nicias, had given them good advice, and that now the safety of the enterprise would be fully assured. And here's the key line. Everyone, in other words, all of the Athenians alike, had fallen in love with the voyage. Now, the word there used for love is eros. So the result is that all of the Athenians had an eros for the expedition to Sicily. And Thucydides then gives an amazing description of the blinding power of eros at the level of politics. He says, the older men, believing that either they would overwhelm the places they sailed against, or that so great a force could at least suffer no disaster, the younger men of military age, yearning to see the far-off sights and spectacles, full of good hope for their safe return. Now, 2 points about that particular sentence. The younger military age people, they were yearning to see these far-off sights. Now, the word that's translated there as yearning is pathos, and the far-off sights or spectacles, that's theoria. So the young men of military age had a pathos for theoria. This in itself is an extremely powerful psychological insight, because what Thucydides is telling us is that the eros that swept all across the entirety of Athens manifested itself in the young military-aged men as a pathos for theoria. To have a yearning for spectacles, a pathos for theoria, that's simply a junior level kind of version of philosophy, which is to say the longing and wonder for things unknown. But continuing, Thucydides, again in his own name, says, and the mass of common soldiery, seeing an opportunity to earn some money in the short term and to acquire a power that would be an endless source of earnings in the future. And so, in the face of this extreme passion on the part of the majority, anyone who felt otherwise was afraid of seeming disloyal if he voted against and therefore held his peace. And the Greek that gets translated as extreme passion right there, that's pleonon, epithumia. And the importance of that word pleonon is that pleonexia is always understood to be inherent in the soul of man, whether it's in Plato, whether it's in Thucydides, whether it's in Aristotle, that is always the greatest danger. What that means, pleonexia, or pleonon here as an adjective, is that it is always grasping for more. Nothing satisfies it, always grasping ever more. And it's that last sentence right there. You really have it. The power of fashion when it concerns political eros. It silences all opponents. And let me emphasize, it's the power of political eros to silence anyone else dissenting that makes it, in other words, political eros, so incredibly powerful. As I'll go into great detail in a later discussion, every single thing about the world in which we live today, in other words, the modern world, was deliberately set into motion by the early modern founders through exploiting political eros in the form of vanity and fashion. And precisely that is going to be what undergirds their anti-biblicism, by which I simply mean the ways in which they manipulated biblical scripture to justify their political project. But because of all of this being at stake, let me emphasize here precisely what comes tumbling out of that paragraph by Thucydides in his name about political eros. It was the last sentence of that paragraph concerning the extreme passion of the majority to silence anybody else from dissenting, where we see the fullest import of political eros for Thucydides versus the role of eros in Homer. And so, for instance, whereas in Homer we can see the tragic consequences of eros for glory unbounded in a figure like Achilles, while in Thucydides we have something very similar, but this time at the level of politics. And so that longing, that political eros, exposes an entire people to tragedy. And this also serves as a great point where we can emphasize what it is that is so fundamentally important about eros and pleonexia for the Greeks versus our situation in our own time. And what I mean by that is in all of the Greeks, whether you're talking about Thucydides, Plato, Aristotle, all of them are fundamentally concerned with education, and in particular, the education of man's eros, because in every single case, it is simply understood that man, by nature, has this dangerous element of pleonexia within his soul, always grasping for more. And so the whole purpose of education is not to eradicate that kind of pleonexia. That would be impossible. Rather, it's to educate that eros in the soul of man so that the pleonexia, the always grasping for more, is directed towards noble things. In other words, towards the beautiful. That's what we in our time and our education have lost. And so you see why it is that reading people like Homer or Plato, and here especially with Thucydides, such deliberate and focused reading, studying is so crucial, because it's not simply the fate of one man with unbounded desire for glory on the line. No, in fact, it's an entire people that's at stake. And that is what gets us to the core of what Thucydides has found that's so universal about the particular of the Peloponnesian War. And so you see all of these things coming together, namely the irreducible element of chance in motions for man in political community, along with how it is that in these periods of brief rest where man's power of mind has the opportunity to show itself, most especially by way of techne, to accomplish greatness amid the ceaseless flux, but with this opportunity to accomplish greatness, there is also the ever-present danger of misdirected eros. And remember, our theme here in this entire series is the role of technology and nihilism, and the misdirection of eros at its very height of mind in the form of techne is going to be where we find in Thucydides the role of the divine. And so with all of that on the table now, we turn back to the archaeology and begin our way into paragraph 4. And so beginning in the 4th paragraph, Thucydides says the following: Minos was the earliest known figure we hear about to acquire a navy, and he made himself master over most of what is now called the Hellenic Sea. He ruled over the Cyclades, in other words, a ring of islands, and was in most cases the first to found colonies in them, driving out their inhabitants, the Carians, and installing his own sons as rulers. Now let me just add here that you wouldn't necessarily know it, but this is a very important point in the text, because remember how all of the things that were lacking that characterized the earliest times of the peoples that were in Greece, the very first sign of those things being overcome, as we saw in the previous paragraph, was the Trojan War. And as Thucydides told us, the real source of the Trojan War was not simply technological innovation, but technological innovation on the sea. And so in saying that Minos is the first to found a navy, what Thucydides is telling us is that Minos was the first to harness the power of mind at the level of political rule. And I'll simply add that this is going to be a radical distinction from what we find in Plato, particularly the dialogue that's titled Minos, and especially the longest dialogue, Plato's Laws. In both of those cases, Minos as a lawgiver and founder is going to be associated with the divine. And what we're seeing right here in Thucydides is that yes, Minos is associated as a lawgiver and founder, but there's nothing whatsoever said about the divine. In fact, it's techne, technological innovation, that is the source of Minos' power, his strength, as a lawgiver and founder. And continuing, Thucydides says, Minos probably also cleared piracy from the seas as far as he was able to enable his revenues to get through to him more easily. For in earlier times, the Greeks and those of the barbarians who lived on the coast of the mainland or on the islands turned to piracy as soon as the passage of ships between them built up. They were led in this, in other words, the pirates were led in this, by their most powerful men, who acted both for their own gain and to provide for the needy. They directed their attacks at cities that were unwalled and consisted of village settlements and raided these, making most of their living from this activity, which was not yet regarded as anything to be ashamed of, but had a certain prestige. The same attitude is illustrated by some people on the mainland even today who glory in such exploits, and by the early poets who invariably ask the same question of those arriving anywhere by sea, whether they were pirates, the assumption being that neither would those questioned disavow the practice, nor would those concerned to know the answer blame them for it. On the mainland, too, men raided each other, and even up to the present day many parts of Greece live by the old ways. The Aetolian Locrians, the Aetolians, the Acarnanians, and that part of the mainland generally. The habit of bearing arms in these mainland communities is a remnant from the old practice of piracy. Indeed, in the whole of Greece, men used to go around armed, since their settlements were unprotected, and travel between them was unsafe, and so they got used to carrying weapons in their everyday life, just as barbarians do. The parts of Greece that still live this way are an indication of practices once universal everywhere. All right, so that's the fourth paragraph. Now, the most important thing in that paragraph is the introduction of Minos. It's Minos who establishes the first navy. And then notice also what Thucydides adds regarding the establishment of that navy. He gets control of the piracy, which is to say, he establishes safety on the seas, and in doing so, he ensures the safety of revenues. In other words, he safeguards the accumulation of wealth that results from commerce, which is to say, contact with other peoples, either by land or especially on sea. And so by establishing the first navy, what Minos does is he's able to ensure the establishment and the coming into greatness of cities. And so in terms of all of the flux, the motions that hindered all of the earliest Greeks from the earliest times in achieving anything great, what we can say is that Minos masters the motions on the sea. And so with Minos, we have the theme of techne, or what we think of as technological innovation. And to be more specific in terms of the previous paragraph, what we have is that with Minos, the theme of techne, or the artisan, or the craftsman, enters into the discussion. Because from the shipbuilder to the establishment of the navy to the successful flourishing of commerce and trade, we get the accumulation of wealth, which is to say the revenue that is necessary for a city to flourish. And also notice especially in that paragraph the constant juxtaposition between the old and the new. In fact, in saying that there are still cities on the mainland where people carry around weapons, Thucydides is all but explicitly saying the earliest of Greeks were barbarians. And so again, the fundamental distinction had not yet been made between barbarism and Greekness. But with Minos, which is to say the establishment of a navy, which is to say the establishment of the arts, that changes. And Greekness as such strides onto the stage as the establishment of the first navy, which is to say, again, and to emphasize, the successful establishment or institutionalization of techne, art, the artisan, craftsmanship, technological innovation. Now, because of the way that Greek is written, translators will often split paragraphing or combine paragraphing in their own various ways. And so in the Cambridge edition, the one that I'm reading from, the entirety of everything I just read was paragraphs 4, 5, and a little bit of the opening of paragraph 6. And he placed them all in one single paragraph. And so we're about to start the translator's paragraph 6. But depending upon the translation that you have, it might be a different paragraph, but keep in mind, all of the translations include the numeration of paragraphs that are found in Thucydides. And so you can always keep track of the paragraphs by Thucydides' paragraphs. And that's what I'll always try my best to stick to, namely Thucydides' paragraphing of the text. Which, again, just to emphasize, you'll always find Thucydides' paragraphing on the left or right margin of any of the translations that you're reading from. And if this sounds confusing, don't even worry about it. So this is just a slight editorial sidebar by me to help you as you're following along in whatever translation that you're using of the text. And so with that being said, Thucydides continues as follows. The Athenians were the first of the Greeks to put aside their arms and adopt a more relaxed and comfortable lifestyle. This taste for indulgence meant that only recently did the older men among the well-off give up wearing tunics of linen and pinning their hair back in a knot fastened with golden cicada brooches. The older generation of Ionians had, through their kinship with the Athenians, adopted the same style of dress, and it persisted a long time among them. The Spartans, on the other hand, were the first to adopt a simpler form of dress in the modern fashion, and in other respects, too, the better off among them made every effort to share the lifestyle of the ordinary people. They, in other words, the Spartans, were also the first to strip naked for exercise in public and anoint themselves with oil afterwards. The old way, including at the Olympic Games, was for athletes to compete wearing loincloths to cover their genitals, and this practice only ceased a few years ago. There are still those among the barbarians, even now, particularly those from Asia, who wear loincloths for their boxing and wrestling contests. Indeed, one might point to many other respects in which the customs of Greece long ago resembled those of the barbarians today. Okay, so that's the entirety of paragraph 6, regardless of whatever translation you're working from. So we're back up to speed with Thucydides' paragraphing. We've completed the entirety of paragraph 6. And that paragraph begins with Thucydides saying that it was the Athenians who were the first to adopt a more comfortable and relaxed lifestyle. And the primary characteristic of this more comfortable lifestyle is that they didn't have to carry their weapons around with them. And now remember where things ended in the previous paragraph, namely that the reason people had to carry their weapons around with them in their everyday life was because in the earliest times of Greece, the defining characteristics of the people is that they were weak. They were lacking all of those things that techne, art, craftsmanship, which is to say the power of mind, provides for them. All of that was absent. They lacked walls, they lacked large numbers of people, they lacked greatness. And in the absence of greatness, it's simply every man for himself. And so every man has to carry their own weapons around with them to guard against everybody. And so here again, Thucydides is telling us Athens was the first. That's where Greekness first shows itself. And in particular, the fruits of Greekness are a more relaxed and comfortable lifestyle. And we can't lose sight of the fact that the more comfortable and relaxed lifestyle is in opposition to the earlier lifestyle of barbarism. And so when Thucydides tells us that Greekness first shows itself with Athens, in other words, that the Athenians were the first Greeks, what he's telling us in this passage in particular is that the greatness of the Greeks in their power of mind is far superior in strength to merely the power of might makes right with the barbarians. And what that means here is that the Athenians are the first to show how confident they are in the power of their mind through techne to defend them against the might makes right of the barbarians, that they don't even have to carry their own individual weapons around with them, because their strength, their greatness, resides defensively and collectively in their numbers, their walls, their wealth, and as we're going to see much later, their navy. And again, all of this is a result of the power of mind mastering the fundamental flux of all motions that are ever and always ceaseless through techne, which is to say the arts, craftsmanship, technological innovation. Now, what's so amazing about this is that this is our first glimmer of daring that mastery over motion in the form of techne, technology, always leads to. And in particular, we see this in the Athenians. In other words, the daring of mind and its confidence of strength first shows itself as Greekness through the Athenians. In other words, this on the small scale is exactly what will later show itself in the expedition to Sicily that I mentioned previously, which ruins the Athenians. But there's still more to be said here in this paragraph because we need to understand how it is that this more comfortable and relaxed lifestyle, as a result of the mastery of motion through mind in the form of techne, leads to the nudity or the nakedness of man in competition. Probably what is most helpful for us in understanding this question of the nakedness or the nudity of man in competition comes from the Parthenon phrase. And I'm going to explain why, but I want to add here that this is especially helpful for us in this text because it's none other than Pericles who's going to be the one that initiates the construction of the Parthenon phrase. And it turns out that it has everything to do with our topic of techne and nihilism, and in particular, the techne or the technology of the Athenians. In fact, it's so important that Plutarch tells us about this in the life of Pericles. And so I'll just read real quickly what Plutarch has to say about it. And I'm going to read from the Waterfield translation, but it's important to understand that it's very difficult to find good translations of Plutarch's lives. Waterfield is certainly better than the one that most people have, which is to say the Dryden edition, but there are still some problems in the Waterfield translation, and so I'll adjust his translation of the Greek here and there accordingly. And as a sidebar, I need to add that my very good friends, Ancient Philosophy and Alejandro, helped me a lot with this, and really in invaluable ways, because they're the kind of friends that nerds like me pray for. But that's for a separate discussion on friendship in Aristotle. So I'll just pick up here in section 11 of Plutarch's Life of Pericles. Plutarch says, at the time in question, Pericles made a particular point of easing the reins or the bridle on the people, and he began to design his policies with a view to their gratification. And a more literal reading of that is that Pericles was politicking or governing with an eye towards the people's gratification or favor. He was always thinking up something to put on in the city, a spectacle for general consumption, a public feast, a procession. He used a series of not entirely tasteless pleasures to keep control over the city. Now, what's most interesting there is that the phrase not entirely tasteless translates literally in the Greek, not without the muses. So not to overthink this, but it's almost as if Plutarch wants to say that what Pericles was doing was with the muses, once you get rid of those double negatives, but he holds back and uses the much less stronger version of not without the muses, because as we're going to see, it's going to become very difficult to ascribe any kind of piety to Pericles. And so we can summarize what's being said here as follows. Pericles is courting the favor of the public by politicking or governing, always with an eye to public spectacles. And keep in mind that the Greek word for spectacles there has the valence of contemplation, theoria. But Pericles is putting on these public spectacles that are not without the muses, Or alternatively, he's governing by way of spectacles that are pleasing to the public, that reach towards the divine, but they're not the divine. They're made or performed or put on by man. But continuing into section 12, Plutarch says the following: the provisions of his, in other words, the provisions of Pericles, which was the greatest source of pleasure and improvement for Athens, and the greatest source of astonishment for everyone else in the world, was that which all by itself confirms for Greece that her much vaunted ancient power and prosperity have not been misrepresented, that is, the construction of the sacred buildings. And for us in particular, that's especially going to include the Parthenon phrase. But continuing, Plutarch says, of all Pericles' policies, this was the one which his enemies particularly maligned and criticized time and again in the assemblies. They howled, the fame and reputation of the Athenian people are suffering because of the transference of that common Greek funds, in other words, the treasury, from Delos to our own keeping. Moreover, Pericles has undermined the most plausible excuse we had to offer our critics, namely, that the removal of the treasury from Delos, had been prompted by fear of the Persians, in the sense that we wanted to have it in a safe place where we could guard it. The Greeks regard it as an outrageously arrogant treatment. In other words, all of the non-Athenians regard it as an outrageously arrogant treatment, and most especially as blatant tyranny, when they can see that we are using the funds they were forced to contribute for the military defense of all Greece to gild and embellish our city, as if she were a vain woman adorning herself with costly marble, statues, and temples at 1,000 talents a time. So what Plutarch is telling us is that the greatest way in which Pericles pandered to the people of Athens was in the construction of these great buildings, and in particular the Parthenon phrase, with the money that Athens was bringing in as tribute from all the rest of Greece, in other words, from all the other peoples of Greece, given to Athens, and only to be used for the building up and strengthening of the military in defense of all of Greece, of all the peoples of Greece, against the Persians, in case they are to invade again, so that Athens can lead the charge against them, the Persians, in defense of all of the people of Greece. Pericles moves that treasury from Delos to Athens, and then proceeds to use it as his own piggy bank to fund beautification of Athens. And Thucydides himself is going to tell us that this use of money, of the revenues that were supposed to be in defense of any future Persian wars, ends up being, in fact, a source for the Peloponnesian War. In other words, all the other Greek peoples see this as an abuse by Athens of their money, which is supposed to be for building defenses in case the Persians invade again, and yet there Athens is decking itself out as if it's a woman on a shopping spree. Now, the imagery there of a vain woman, or more specifically, effeminacy amid greatness, or probably better stated, amid the kind of blurring of the beautiful and the good that we would otherwise call greatness, that's extremely important. And it's going to arise again, and most especially in Machiavelli. But that's in the series that I'm doing on the transformation from pre-modernity to modernity, and the question of Christianity as these understandings of virtue begin to change. But I just want to point that out here because it is extremely important, and it gets to the deepest philosophical meaning of the saying that you sometimes hear, that hard times produce hard men produce good times produce soft men, and then soft men produce hard times, and then the cycle repeats. But again, I can't get into it here, but there is an enormous amount of insight to be gleaned from any number of these great books on that topic. But as it stands here, this is what Plutarch says that Pericles' response is to that criticism. Pericles used to tell the Athenian people that, since they were defending the allies and keeping the Persians at bay, they were not accountable to them for the money. The tribute the allies paid consisted only of money, not of horses, ships, or soldiers. And money, he claimed, belongs to its recipient, not its donors, as long as the recipients provide the services for which they're being paid. Moreover, he argued that once the city had been adequately supplied with military necessities, it needs to direct any surplus it has accumulated towards enterprises which, when completed, will bring eternal glory and while in progress, will provide immediate prosperity. And then there's the all-important clause. He says, in the sense that they will generate all kinds of work and a wide range of requirements, which by stimulating all the arts and crafts, in other words, technology, and getting every hand moving, put almost the whole city in receipt of wages, so that the city is simultaneously being embellished and supported out of its own resources. So let me emphasize here, part of Pericles' response, and what I'm suggesting is the most important part for our purposes, is that the surplus of money that remained after the military necessities had been taken care of was to be used for enterprises which, when completed, would bring Athens eternal glory. And it's precisely these enterprises in the pursuit of eternal glory that stimulate innovation in technology. Now, I'm going to have a lot more to say about that here in just a moment after I read just a little bit more of what Plutarch has to say on this. But suffice it to say that right now, there's much more to what's going on here than the charge that Pericles is simply acting tyrannical. In fact, as we're going to see, a better way to understand what's going on right here is with reference to what Plato's Socrates in the Republic refers to as the feverish city. And I'm going to go into this in great detail in my series on Plato's longest dialogue, the Laws. But the short of it, for our purposes right here, goes back to what I had mentioned at the very beginning of this discussion concerning the relationship between mind and passion. Namely, when mind shows itself in the form of or technology that corrects for or even caters to man's passions in the form of a life more pleasurable, the equilibrium between what man can attain or what he has and what he desires becomes very unstable, especially when you account for the temporality of mind, which is to say, man's imagination that can project into the future, man's desires for the future, because that's exactly what is meant by enterprises. In other words, these promised projects going forward, because it's that promise that sits in the future that man doesn't quite yet have that causes this combination of mind and passion, which is exactly this thing that we call the soul, to become feverish. Now, from Goethe into Spengler in the 20th century, that's going to become a philosophical concept. It's going to be known as Faustian man. But as we're seeing right here in Plutarch and Thucydides, the so-called Faustian man is nothing more and possibly something less than this problem that's located in both Thucydides and Plutarch here, with not simply Pericles or even Periclean Athens, but in fact this thing called Greekness that Thucydides has guided us into, and precisely because it is what separates the peoples of Greece, and in particular the Athenians, from not simply barbarism, but the universal barbarism that stood at the earliest times, which is to say that the fundamental flux, the motions and chance that defines all things, and even and especially all the human things, which is to say political things, is barbarism. And one never escapes that. But instead, you have these rare occasions where mind is finally able to have enough rest so that it can show itself in the form of technology, to master the motions, to master the flux. And the fundamental question that Thucydides has his finger on the pulse of in those opening paragraphs that have brought us to this point is whether and to what extent and how long such mastery through and that especially includes the art of politics, or politike in Greek, the art of politics, can endure. And as I've said in this discussion already, that question can be restated as whether wise statesmanship can last or endure given the very problematic nature of man. And all of this has come tumbling out of just those first 6 or 7 passages in the opening of Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. And that really should blow you away because here we are witnessing just how powerful these primary original pre-modern texts can be for showing us that the things that we often think are so new and novel were known very, very long ago. And not simply known, but wrestled with very, very significantly. And so let me phrase that more provocatively. What gets known in the 20th century as Faustian man, or in Heidegger with the question concerning technology, was known millennia ago. And not only was it known, but it's understood to be, as we're seeing here, an inherent characteristic of the very nature of man himself, and with particular emphasis for man in political community. That political relevance is what's so crucial, because as we're waking up now to all of these various and seemingly existential problems with regard to our own politics today, these primary texts offer us guidance as alternatives to what we think are the solutions today. And so we really fool ourselves when we simply think that because of our technology today, none of these older texts have anything to teach us. Because as we're seeing, it's quite the opposite. These old texts, diagnosed at the most foundational level, which is to say human nature in political community, so very many of these problems associated with technology today that we think are unique to us. The science is certainly new, there's no doubt about that, but it's the nature of man with that combination of mind and passion and projecting it into the future as these various goals or enterprises that absolutely has not changed. In fact, the emphasis, our emphasis on the things we call STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, have blinded us to that most foundational understanding of ourselves. And so this problematic combination that we call soul of mind and passion is the true core of this thing that we call the question of technology. And again, we are seeing through this slow, careful, focused reading of Thucydides, with some admittedly long asides to Plutarch, that offers just as much insight into this problem of technology, if not more, because of the emphasis on self-knowledge in political community, than really anything that's been written ever since the advent of modern science. But that's where we're going with this series, and we'll see that really come out once we get to Machiavelli, Francis Bacon, Hobbes, Locke, Spinoza, but that's our own future enterprise here in this Technology and Nihilism series on my Athens Corner website. But let me read a little bit more of what Plutarch has to tell us here, because it's going to clarify that or support that even more. And so we're still in section 12, and Plutarch is describing Pericles' response to his critics. He says, campaigns abroad enabled those of the right age and degree of physical fitness to be well paid out of the common purse. But since Pericles did not like to see the crowd of disorganized artisans excluded from payment while wanting to avoid paying them for remaining unproductive and idle, he enthusiastically introduced before the assembly impressive schemes for constructions and plans for work that would employ a wide range of skills and take time to complete, so that those who stayed at home might have just as much of a reason to be paid out of the public funds and to share in the general prosperity as those who were out at sea or on garrison duty or serving in the army. Now let's pause for a moment just to assess here the significance of what's being said, because it's much more than just merely rhetoric meant to cover over dishonesty. The argument that Pericles is making is that in the same way that all of the soldiers are off and getting paid to defend all of Greece from a return of the Persians, those people in Athens who are not off at war need to be getting paid as well. And so think of it this way. Because all of Greece is paying Athens in particular to protect their freedom, Pericles is saying that, okay, we can do that, but in order to do that, it's also going to require that our non-soldiers don't fall behind in wealth in comparison to the soldiers who are gaining wealth. It would cause too much of an unrest in the name of injustice back at home in Athens. And so the cost of freedom of all of Greece is that at the least, Athens is going to appear tyrannical over Greece. Now, whether they are in fact a tyranny over all of Greece in the name of freedom, that's also what we're going to find in Thucydides. And that, of course, is what makes it again so incredibly relevant, because the fundamental question we're seeing at issue here, and all because of greatness in techne, is that because war is of necessity a profitable activity, these things that we call freedom and tyranny are not nearly as clear-cut as we might otherwise think. And you could say that that's the philosophical depth in our proverb or our saying that freedom isn't free. And then skipping ahead just a little bit to section 13, Plutarch continues as follows. For all the wonderful size, inimitable beauty, and exceptional charm of the buildings that then began to arise, and for all the fine workmanship of the craftsmen, who were striving to surpass the limits of their craft, the most astonishing thing of all was the speed of the results. Whereas people imagined that each of them would take many successive generations, at least, to be completed, every one of them was finished within the prime of a single administration. That administration, of course, being Pericles' administration. And so he's getting credit for this. And Plutarch continues. This is what makes Pericles' works even more impressive, because they have durability despite having been completed quickly. In terms of beauty, each of them was a classic straight away at the time, but in terms of vigor, each is a new and recent creation even today. And so a kind of freshness forms a constant bloom on them and keeps their appearance untouched by time, as if they contained an evergreen spirit and an unchanging soul mingled together. Now that last sentence right there is amazing. The constructions or the buildings through techne, and again, especially the Parthenon Frege, were immediately recognized as classics despite their newness. And so amazing were they that they seemed timeless. And not even describing them as timeless is enough, because then Plutarch goes on to say that these products of techne, artisanship, craftsmanship, were as if they contained an evergreen spirit, pneuma is the Greek there, and an unaging soul, the Greek there being psyche. So these creations of techne were as if they contained within themselves both an always flourishing or evergreen spirit, pneuma, and an unaging, or perhaps better, undecaying soul, or psyche. In other words, the craftsmen, the artisans, or what we might call the technologists, have created life, and not simply life, but immortal life with the characteristics of perfection. Now, I suggest for your consideration that that description of anything is and has always been reserved only and exclusively for that which we would consider the divine. But notice there's nothing whatsoever said about the divine in this. And so what we are witnessing here is techne or technology striding onto the stage as a substitute or a replacement for the divine. And in fact, these past few passages that I've read regarding Plutarch's description of Pericles' response to his critics can be understood as Plutarch's commentary on what's probably the most famous speech given in Thucydides by anyone, namely Pericles' funeral oration. And that's where all of this is leading us in Thucydides for the relevance of Thucydides for my entire series here on technology and nihilism. And so again, to emphasize, the greatness that is Greekness is the mastery over the fundamental flux or motions of all things, and especially those things pertaining to the human, as that mastery shows itself, most especially in terms of mind, by way of techne or technology, And that leads to freedom. And as that freedom provides the occasion for mind to get even better in terms of techne, so more mastery over the motions, man becomes daring. And it's precisely in that daring that the peace provided by mind in techne begins to come unstable. In other words, the motions begin to arise again, unrest in the body politic, precisely because freedom begins to at least look a lot like tyranny, and claims of injustice begin to emerge. But all of that said, in what is probably my longest digression, and that's saying a lot, we found ourselves in this long digression because we're trying to understand the nudity that arises in the 6th paragraph of Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. And all along what I've said is that it's the Parthenon Frege that Pericles has commissioned for construction that's our best guide for understanding that nudity. And as we found in Plutarch, the Parthenon Frege, being one of those constructions, is timeless and appears as if to contain an evergreen spirit, an unchanging or undecaying soul. Okay, so let's talk about that combination in the Parthenon Frege. On the Parthenon Frege, what we find is a sculpted imitation of a Pan-Hellenic procession, and therefore of all such Pan-Hellenic processions, which is to say the Pan-Hellenic Games, or what we now think of as the Olympics. And in that procession, we have two especially important things. We have the young athletes who are clothed, and then we have the young athletes who are nude. And it's that duality, in other words, the clothing and the nudity, in their togetherness that's so important for us here. Because think of it this way. What is an Athenian when he is clothed? Well, his clothing simply represents the fashion, which is to say the conventions of Athens. And what's an Athenian when he's nude? Well, he's simply an Athenian lacking the conventions. And that's to say that he is man simply, separated entirely from any conventions. And so what the procession shows is that what's so characteristic about the Athenians, and remember, the Athenians are Greekness, is that they can be both by nature and convention simultaneously. In other words, the capacity of the Athenians, which again means what Greekness is such that it can move back and forth between nature and convention simultaneously. And it's precisely this ability or this capacity to see in man as such both his nature and his convention that most characterizes this Greekness that we've been talking about. And so what Greekness at its height, which is to say with the Athenians, means is that it's man's ability to see any convention, and the Greek word there is nomos, as a convention. And as a convention, it is only a particular, but also being able to see the nature behind the convention. That's what's especially crucial here. But we have to be very careful here because the conventions of a people are taken by that people as the way things are. And that's why, for instance, the Greek word nomos can also mean law, because the conventions of a people that define the way of the people is always most representative in the laws of the people. And in fact, and this is something that I'll get into very deeply in my series on Plato's laws, in Plato's dialogue, the Minos, Socrates flatly says, law or nomos, convention, wishes to be the discovery of the beings, or what is. The Greek there is ta onta. That's where we get our word ontology from. And so one way to think of what Socrates is claiming is that law wishes to be ontology. In other words, the conventions of a people that define its way of life, those conventions wish to be the very nature of all that is. And to say that we want our conventions, our ways, especially represented through our laws, to reflect the natures of what is nothing more than simply saying that we wish to live according to what we know is true. And so the discrepancy between a people's conventions versus the nature of the way things truly are, that discrepancy, or the possibility of a discrepancy, is exactly the origin of this activity that we call philosophy. And so the danger, and it's an enormous danger, in discovering that a convention doesn't match up to the nature of what it is supposed to reflect. And let's be perfectly clear, this is the danger of the activity of philosophy, is that someone might say, I guess my people's is no different than any other people's. It's all conventions. And we recognize that as a kind of relativism or just outright nihilism. But what we have with the Parthenon Frege, with the young athletes who are clothed and the young athletes who are nude, is that what the Greeks accomplish in seeing both together, in other words, nature and convention together, or physis and nomos together, is that they're able to contemplate that which is other than them in a dispassionate way without reacting in horror by flatly destroying whatever the other is, precisely because it is not their way, and also without reacting with such admiration that they themselves transform into whatever the other is. And so it's that ability to dualize nature and convention, physis and nomos, without falling into relativism and without zealously transforming themselves into whatever that other thing is. That's what characterizes the Athenians, and in particular, Greekness. And so it's that dualizing that comes out of this question of the nakedness or the nudity of man in competition. And I simply have to add as a sidebar that I learned so much of this from Alex Prio. Alex has a really amazing paper on Herodotus where some of these topics get addressed, because this question of nakedness in Thucydides can be related in an extremely important way to the nudity that we find in Herodotus with regard to Gyges. But that's a separate discussion. And for our purposes here, it's that dualizing of nature and convention simultaneously and dispassionately that's at the heart of this question of nudity in this paragraph. And remember, it's made possible by the mastery of motion or stasis through techne as it shows itself at the political level, and this occurs first, according to Thucydides, with the Athenians. And that really is quite amazing when you think about it, because so very many things are coming together here. We've got Plutarch, we've got Thucydides, we've got Herodotus, all coming together to help us understand Greekness as opposed to the universal barbarism, at least according to Thucydides, that's definitive of the earliest of the Greeks. Athens pulls Greece out of that universal barbarism into a comfortable lifestyle, the most important characteristic of which is shown in nudity during athletic competitions. I bet you didn't see that coming. And so now let me pick back up in Thucydides with the 7th paragraph. Thucydides says, the cities that were more recently established at a time when seafaring was getting easier were starting to have more ample resources, and so were fortified with walls and were built right on the coastline. And they occupied isthmuses with a view to trade and to strengthen themselves against their neighbors. Ancient cities, by contrast, because of the long persistence of piracy, were usually built away from the sea, whether on islands or on the mainland, since the pirates used to raid non-seafaring communities on the coast, as well as plundering each other. And to this day, these are still inland settlements. Okay, so that's the 7th paragraph, and we see that the pirates have returned. So from the glimpse of the greatness that is Greekness in the previous passage, namely paragraph 6 about the nudity, Thucydides has brought us back to a recognition of the primordial and the original universal barbarism that Greekness itself is distinguished from. And again, we see the form of that Greekness in terms of techne everywhere in that paragraph 7, because we have the walls for defenses, that makes cities possible, and the cities are established on the coastline because contact with other peoples now is understood to be a good thing by way of commerce and trade, which itself is only made possible through advancement in techne regarding seafaring. So again, it's that theme of the craftsman, which is to say techne, that Thucydides is really honing in on and distinguishing from the earlier times. In other words, we have a battle of the ancients versus the moderns going on here. And I mean that in the literal sense in this paragraph. You have the ancient cities versus the modern cities. And for Thucydides, that's always going to show itself in favor of the moderns with their mastery of the motions, both in terms of the elemental, which is to say in this case the oceans or the seas, and in terms of man, which is to say war or piracy. And what we can say at this point is that the characteristic of mastery over the non-human or the elemental, in this case the sea and the ocean, in conjunction with the mastery over the human, which is to say wise statesmanship, that first showed itself with Minos and his recognition of the power of establishing a navy for the greatness of his city to become possible, precisely that takes us back to the opening sentence of the text itself. Thucydides there went out of his way to let his reader know that he, Thucydides, is an Athenian. And what we've seen from these 7 paragraphs tells us that Thucydides, the Athenian, is firmly in the camp of the moderns, which is to say that he is firmly in the camp of the power of mind to master the fundamental flux of both the non-human and the human by way of techne. But we can't forget that it is precisely the power of that mastery to establish peace over the fundamental flux, whether it's human or non-human, that is always at risk of becoming daring to such an extent that the mastery of the motion in terms of techne becomes unstable and is thrown once again into the fundamental flux, which is to say barbarism. And that's to say that barbarism, most especially represented by the pirates in Thucydides, is always and ever looming on the horizon. And that is the meaning of the daring of mind. In other words, the power of mind and a return to universal barbarism are always yoked together of necessity because of the nature of man. And to believe that one can be separated from the other, or that the power of mind in techne can permanently master the threat of a return to universal barbarism, that belief is a fundamental failure to understand the nature of man. And for Thucydides, the only teacher capable of instructing man about that ever-present threat inherent to his very nature is the harsh, merciless teacher of war. And let's be perfectly clear about what this understanding or claim of human nature means, because it goes hand in hand with the thrust of the argument that Thucydides has been making in these opening 7 paragraphs, namely that all things decay, everything perishes, and in fact, everything naturally perishes. Precisely that is the unstated premise of the entire archaeology, which is to say those first 20 or 21 paragraphs, of Thucydides' account of the Peloponnesian War. And we can phrase that even more provocatively. The universal that Thucydides has found from within the particular of the Peloponnesian War is that war exhausts all human possibilities. That is, there's no Archimedean point from which one can stand outside of war in order to achieve a better human possibility than what can be found from within war. Another way to phrase this is how Heraclitus does in the claim that war is the father of all things. And probably the best example of this unstated premise is what we're about to read in the 8th paragraph. And so continuing our careful and meticulous reading through these paragraphs, this is what Thucydides has to say next. The islanders were just as much involved in piracy. These were Carians and Phoenicians who had settled most of the islands. There's evidence for this. When Delos was purified by the Athenians in the course of this war, and all the graves of the dead were dug up, the Athenians found that more than half of them were Carian, recognizable from the style of the weapons buried alongside them and the manner of their burial, which is still practiced today. When the navy of Minos was established, however, Travel between places by sea became easier since he cleared the wrongdoers out of the islands in the process of colonizing most of them. So those who lived on the coast were now more able to pursue the acquisition of wealth and lived in greater security. Some even building walls around their cities on the basis of their newfound prosperity. And in the desire for material gain, the weaker submitted to the domination of the stronger, while the stronger, with the advantage of more resources, made the smaller cities subservient. This was already largely the situation when they later made the expedition against Troy. Okay, so that's paragraph 8, and there's an enormous amount that's going on there. But notice first that in the last paragraph, paragraph 7, he ended it by saying that even on the islands, the ancient cities were built away from the coastline in fear of piracy. And here, in this paragraph, he amends that slightly by saying that even the islands were complicit in the piracy. So once again, universal barbarism of the earliest times. And it's in pointing to the evidence for this that we're able to glean his unstated premise that's been operative from the very beginning. During the course of this war, in other words, Thucydides, the author, is telling us here at the very beginning that he knows the end, and he's using that knowledge as he's writing it from the beginning. But the Athenians purify delos, and so the very first appearance of anything remotely resembling the divine, other than techne, strides onto the stage here with the discovery of something that's apparently surprising, namely an ancient peoples, the Carians. And let's understand what that means. In purifying Delos, the Athenians discover a people from a much earlier time who were great enough to have burial sites with warriors in possession of their weapons. So the Carians were great enough to be memorialized at the time of their death, only to be lost into oblivion and discovered by mere chance by a much later people, the Athenians, performing their own sacred practices of their own divine. And so all great things decline. And not only do they decline, but they perish into oblivion. And then what's so amazing is that in the discovery of the perishability of all things, Minos comes back. And remember, Minos was the first to establish a navy, which is to say that Minos was the first to apply the revealing of mind in terms of techne to statesmanship, because we simply cannot overemphasize that statesmanship, or we could even say justice, is itself an art at the level of politics. Now, the question of what justice is, that's quite different. That's extremely philosophical. But once it's decided what justice is, the art of the founder, and the Greek word there is nomothetiki, consists in laying down laws, and that absolutely is an art. And wise statesmanship is the art of continuing or ensuring that that founding endures. And so here, what we're witnessing in this particular passage, with the return of Minos, in the wake of the perishability of all things, is a kind of re-emphasis by Thucydides of techne, which gets to the core of what we've been saying distinguishes the Greeks from the barbarians. And that itself is to say what distinguishes this new thing under the sun, according to Thucydides, namely Greekness, from barbarism. And immediately upon introducing Minos again, notice what Thucydides says. Once Minos had established his navy, and again, that's the first navy, travel between places by sea became easier because Minos' navy cleared out the pirates. But Thucydides says he did that in the process of establishing colonies. And so contained within that observation is the teaching that with the increase in techne, which is to say the rise of the artisan, and as it gets employed by the statesman, we see the rise of empire. And so just as we noted earlier, the distinction between freedom and empire is not immediately clear, because freedom on the sea comes at the cost of an empire. And in fact, the rest of the paragraph is going to be an amazing commentary on that. He says those who lived on the coast were now, in other words, with the establishment of Minos' empire, more able to pursue the acquisition of wealth, and lived in greater security, some even building walls around their cities on the basis of their newfound prosperity. So what Thucydides is pointing out here is that empire, despite whatever cost it comes for any given people, it allows for many to pursue a level of wealth they previously were unable to attain. And then we get what is perhaps the most amazing statement in the entire paragraph. He says that in their desire for material gain, the weak submitted to the domination of the stronger, while the stronger, with the advantage of more resources, made the smaller cities subservient. And so in many ways, this is a double commentary on the claim that might makes right. Because what he's saying is that yes, with more material resources, which we could just as easily here say is simply with more techne or technology, the stronger do in fact make the weaker submit. But, and this is the more important part, the weaker are willing to submit so long as they're able to pursue more material wealth than they would otherwise have had. And that's an astonishing claim, because what it means is that men will give up their freedom so long as they're compensated for that in terms of some kind of more luxurious, or we could even say merely comfortable way of life. Now we have to understand here, this is an at least twofold teaching on human nature. Namely, those who are by nature stronger will in fact at some point exercise dominance over those who are weaker. That's at least one aspect of human nature. And another aspect of human nature is that those who are weaker by nature can always be bought off with the promise of increased wealth or luxury, or in fact, mere comfortability. And now with those two claims about human nature, which is to say those two universals about all men as men, Thucydides has a psychology in order to understand man, and in particular, in order to understand political man. And so he turns again to Homer, because he ends that paragraph by saying this was already largely the situation when they later made the expedition against Troy. So in turning back to the Trojan War, Thucydides is going to turn back to Homer, and he's going to use this psychology to understand, or as we would say, to psychoanalyze Agamemnon from Homer. And so because this transition back to Homer is so important, I need to be perfectly clear. What Thucydides means when he says this was already largely the situation when they later made the expedition against Troy, what he means when he says the situation there is the psychology that he has just deduced, namely that the stronger will in fact always exercise dominion over the weaker, and the weaker will happily give up their freedoms if it means that they get more material wealth, which is to say more luxury or mere comfortability. And so what Thucydides means when he says that this was already largely the situation when the Greeks made their expedition to Troy, what he means is that precisely that psychology constitutes the critique, or as we might say today, the revisionism of Homer that Thucydides is about to provide. Namely, that those who were stronger due to more resources, or as we would say, techne, technology, were in fact exercising dominion over the weaker, and the weaker were happy to give up their freedoms by simply being bought off. And so with that psychology in mind, Thucydides is now, beginning in paragraph 9, going to engage in a contest with Homer and the poets more broadly regarding the origins and even the greatness of the Trojan War. He says the following: "In my view, Agamemnon was able to assemble his expeditionary force more because he was the most powerful figure of his day than because the suitors of Helen, whom he was leading, were bound by oaths of loyalty to Tyndareus." Now, as a sidebar, I need to add that Tyndareus was Helen of Troy's father, and the oath being mentioned here has its origins in some fragments by Hesiod, and there's also reference to it in Euripides' Iphigenia, and there are some other mentions as well elsewhere, but the point is simple. Thucydides is contesting the origin of the Trojan War, commonly associated with Helen of Troy being seduced and taken from Menelaus, who was Agamemnon's brother. And Thucydides is telling us that that's an incorrect account of the origin of the war. He's saying, no, the origin of the Trojan War was precisely because those who were naturally stronger exercised dominion over the weaker, and the weaker are easily bought off. And so the stronger, in this case, is Agamemnon, and the weaker are those he bought off to go with him to battle the Trojans. And so it was material wealth that was the bond of their allegiance, and not anything like loyalty or an oath to Helen's father. And so notice the great contrast there. Thucydides is saying no, oaths, or the sacredness of an oath, which would always invoke the divine, that's not what made Agamemnon strong. What made Agamemnon strong was his material wealth and the fact that other men are bought off so easily, which is to say that other men are bought off or bought out of any kind of oaths that they make. Now let's make sure we understand just how radical this is. In a single stroke, Thucydides has gutted the entirety of the gods from Homer. Just let that sink in for a minute. And remember, this discussion is part of the series I'm doing on technology and nihilism. And so just continuing, he says, according to the clearest traditional account of the Peloponnesians, Pelops was the first to achieve power there, and despite arriving as an immigrant, he gave his name to the place because of the great wealth he brought from Asia, coming to a people without means. And so again, we see the psychology being employed here. Pelops was just an immigrant, not even native to Greece. And yet because the people of Greece were so poor and he himself was so wealthy, not only was he able to exercise dominion over them and buy off their allegiance, but they flatly named the place after him, the Peloponnesus. And so the very war that this entire text is about, namely the Peloponnesian War, is Exhibit A for Thucydides' proof that the psychology he's deduced is flatly true. And just to finish off that paragraph, he continues by saying, and later, Pelops' descendants were even better off. Eurystheus was killed in Attica by the Heraclidae, but Atreus was his uncle on his mother's side, having been banished by his father Pelops for killing Chrysippus. And it was to Atreus as his kinsman that Eurystheus had entrusted Mycenae and his realm when he left on his expedition. But when Eurystheus failed to return, Atreus took over Mycenae and the whole of Eurystheus' kingdom. He was supported in this by the Mycenaeans, who feared the Heraclidae and also recognized Atreus' abilities and his popularity with the masses that he had courted. And so the descendants of Pelops became more powerful than those of Perseus. Okay, so that's an enormous amount of genealogy going on there, and I won't bore you with the details of trying to explain it. I'll simply say this. Atreus is the father of Agamemnon and Menelaus. That's why in Homer they're often referred to as the sons of Atreus. And so the fact that Atreus is a relative of Pelops, who had initially banished Atreus, means that at least by blood, Atreus is accorded a right of succession to Mycenae when Eurystheus entrusts Mycenae to Atreus, and Eurystheus himself being a rightful heir by blood to Pelops of Mycenae. And so Eurystheus dies, Atreus inherits Mycenae. And what's important about Atreus is that Thucydides emphasizes that he was a skilled statesman, and particularly with regard to courting the masses. And so what all of that adds up to in that paragraph is Thucydides showing us how it is that an immigrant can be so successful as a result of understanding the human nature that his psychology accounts for, that the immigrant can go to a foreign land and be such a successful founder that his legacy is ensured all the way into the name of the entire region from which the place that he founds is only a part. And also, in mentioning both the Heraclidae and Perseus, Thucydides has no recourse whatsoever to the divine. In other words, all of this can be completely explained without reference to the divine and solely with reference to those two aspects of human nature that constitute the psychology that Thucydides is using to understand all these past events. Now here, as a quick sidebar, the same thing that happened earlier is that the translator of the Cambridge edition inserts a new paragraph. But like I mentioned earlier, all of the editions should have the paragraphing that Thucydides himself uses out to the margin. So we're still in paragraph 9, it's just that in the Cambridge edition, this is a new paragraph. And so continuing, Thucydides says, "In my view then, Agamemnon, with the combination of this inheritance and his superior naval strength, was enabled to put together and launch this expedition less by good will than by the fear he inspired. For he evidently came with the largest contingent of ships himself, and in addition supplied the Arcadians with theirs, as Homer has stated clearly, if he constitutes sufficient evidence." In other words, Thucydides is saying, if Homer constitutes sufficient evidence. So Thucydides himself is raising suspicions about Homer to the reader, and he's going to do this again subsequently in other paragraphs. But continuing, Thucydides says, "And in Homer's account of the handing down of the royal scepter, he further says that Agamemnon was lord over many islands and the whole of Argos. However, being based on the mainland, Agamemnon would not have held power over any islands except local offshore ones, which in that case would not have been many, unless he possessed a significant navy. And it is on this expedition, namely the Trojan War, that we must base our assumptions about what earlier expeditions were like." Okay, and so that's the entirety of the 9th paragraph. And its most important significance is that it's where Thucydides has begun his most powerful critique so far of Homer. And again, notice the emphasis that is placed upon a navy. We need to understand that that emphasis is in no way indicative of a kind of limitation on Thucydides because of his historical circumstances. In other words, it's not the case that Thucydides emphasizes a navy merely because naval innovation was the height of innovation in Thucydides' time. It's certainly true that naval innovation was the height of technological innovation in Thucydides' time. However, the significance of that for Thucydides is that what the navy represents is the culmination of mind to master the ceaseless motions that fundamentally characterize all human and non-human things. And so a powerful navy is representative of mind's mastery over the ceaseless flux of all human and non-human phenomenon, which is to say it is man's approximation to that which is otherwise reserved only and solely for the divine. But that's just the theoretical aspect of the significance of emphasizing the navy for Thucydides. It also has a practical aspect, and that's precisely its role in overcoming all of the fundamental obstacles imposed upon man by the ceaseless flux of all the human and non-human motions found in the earliest times and characteristic of the barbarians, and that kept man from greatness. And it's precisely that element of greatness made possible by a navy, which is to say the power of mind showing itself through techne, incapable of mastering the flux, that Thucydides is about to turn to next. And so in this regard, it's very difficult, if not flatly impossible, to separate the theoretical from the practical in Thucydides. Now, much later, we're going to see that Nietzsche is going to very explicitly claim the impossibility of such a separation between theory and practice. And for different reasons, Heidegger is also going to emphasize this impossibility. But notice how Thucydides ends that paragraph. He says, "And it is on this expedition, in other words, the Trojan War, that we must base our assumptions about what earlier ones were like." So what Thucydides is telling us is that the Trojan War, the Trojan expedition, is the boundary for Thucydides' inquiry of any earlier kinds of greatness from the earlier Greeks. And this is to say that Homer is the boundary of any inquiry into earlier greatness from the Greeks. And that's important because Thucydides is about to make the case that what Homer claimed was great really wasn't that great. And so what this means is that Thucydides' critique of Homer represents Thucydides' critique of what I had mentioned earlier is the fundamental premise of all politics, that the old is the good. And a more provocative way to state that is that the traditional claim that the old is the good is rooted in the fact that the oldest of all the old are the gods. But Thucydides' emphasis on mind showing itself through techne and mastering the ceaseless flux of the human and non-human motions approximates the gods, and the better the approximation is, the less one needs to even recognize the gods. And so what we're witnessing here with the beginning of Thucydides' most sustained critique of Homer is the turning away from the gods and turning towards mind, which is to say techne or technology. And so now we turn to paragraph 10, where Thucydides is about to clarify and expand upon the critique of Homer that he has just begun in paragraph 9. And so beginning paragraph 10, this is what Thucydides says. Now, just because Mycenae was a small place, or because some other township of that period does not now seem to amount to much, that's not a valid reason to doubt, or more literally what the Greek means right there, is anyone using exact evidence would not doubt the size of the joint force as reported by the poets and as traditionally accepted. For just suppose the city of Sparta were wiped out, and all that was left were its shrines and the foundations of its buildings. I think that years later, future generations would find it hard to believe that its power matched up to its reputation. Yet, in fact, the Spartans occupy 2/5 of the Peloponnese, and they're the leaders of the whole of it, as well as being leaders of many allies beyond it. Nevertheless, because they're not united in one city, in other words, because they're not geographically all located in a single city, and they have no lavish shrines or public buildings, but instead live in village settlements in the traditional Greek manner, they would be underestimated. On the other hand, if the Athenians were to suffer the same fate, they would be thought twice as powerful as they actually are just on the evidence of what one can see. Okay, now there are a few things to point out here. The first and most obvious is that Thucydides is seeming to make a concession to the poets, and in particular Homer. He's saying there's no reason to doubt the size of the navy simply because Mycenae, which is to say where Agamemnon was king, has such small ruins today. And then he engages in a kind of thought experiment. Thucydides sees himself projected far into the future and looking back at the ruins of Sparta and Athens. And the significance of that relates back to the previous paragraph concerning the perishability of all things. So again, we're seeing the unstated premise of the entire archaeology show itself in the inquiry. All things perish into oblivion, including Sparta and including Athens. And keep in mind, the point that he's making is that the perishability of all things can very easily lead to a fundamental misunderstanding of those things prior to their perishing. Because as he says, Sparta would look weaker than it was, and Athens would look far more powerful than it was. And so what's going on here is that this is a kind of commentary on that fundamental principle that I had mentioned previously, that the old is the good. Because what this means is that the oldest of all the old might simply be indeterminate for us, which is to say we just can't know it because it's so old. We don't have enough remnants to properly assess the oldest of the old. And it's precisely that indeterminacy that requires Thucydides to have to use Homer as the boundary for his inquiry into great things, looking backwards. It's also going to be extremely thematic in both Plato and Aristotle. And in Plato, it's especially important because it's explicitly going to be linked with knowledge of what I had said previously is always the oldest of the old, which is to say the gods. And this is what I'll go into great detail about in my series on Plato's laws, because that question of what man is to do, lacking sufficient knowledge of the oldest of the old, as a question, is at the very heart of the teachings on politics that we find in Plato, and in particular, his three dialogues, the Republic, the Statesman, and the Laws. And what's especially interesting about the Laws is that it's going to be encompassing of the teachings in both the Republic and the Statesman. But that's for my series on Plato's Laws. But in our case here, after having seemingly made that concession to the poets, and Homer in particular, now what Thucydides is going to do is make the case that the greatness of Homer's Greeks wasn't that great. And we're going to see that everything hinges upon Thucydides' emphasis of techne, or technology, that was lacking during the Trojan War. He says, one should therefore keep an open mind and not judge cities by their appearances rather than by their actual power. And one should accept that the Trojan expedition was the greatest of any up to that time, but smaller than modern or present ones, assuming again that we can trust Homer's account here too. So again, there you have Thucydides raising the question of the very reliability of Homer to the reader. And then he goes further and says, which as a poet he may well have exaggerated for effect. And so now he's flatly criticizing all poets as being prone to hyperbole. So let's reread that sentence from the beginning to get the full effect. One should therefore keep an open mind and not judge cities by their appearances rather than by their actual power. And one should accept that the Trojan expedition was the greatest of any up to that time, but smaller than modern or present ones, assuming again that we can trust Homer's account here too, which as a poet he may well have exaggerated for effect, though even on his reckoning the expedition was comparatively small by our standards. He put the size of the fleet at 1,200 ships and gives the Boeotian contribution as 120 men a ship and that of Philoctetes as 50 a ship, thereby indicating, in my view, the maximum and minimum figures. At any rate, he has not recorded the size of any vessels in his catalogue of ships. That the rowers were also all fighting men, he has made clear in the case of Philoctetes' ships, for he describes all the oarsmen as archers. It's unlikely that there were many passengers apart from kings and others of high office, especially since they were to make the sea crossing with military equipment on board, and their boats were not fitted with upper decks, but were built in the old pirate style. So if you take a middle point between the largest and the smallest vessels, you can see that not so many men went to Troy, considering that this was a combined expedition from the whole of Greece. Okay, and so what we see Thucydides doing here is inferring and interpolating the number of warriors in the Trojan expedition based upon the craftsmanship of the boats that were capable of getting them to Troy, namely the fact that they lacked upper decks and were still of the style of the older pirate ships. So again, techne is everything here in determining greatness. And notice also that that greatness is showing itself through empire. And he's going to clarify this immediately in paragraph 11. He says the following: the reason for this, in other words, the reason for why not as many people were involved in the Trojan expedition as the expeditions of Thucydides' day, was not so much a shortage of men as shortage of means. Because of their lack of supplies, they took quite a modest army, limited to the size they thought could live off the land while on active duty. And after they had won a battle upon arrival, as they clearly did, otherwise they could not have fortified their camp, even then they evidently did not exploit their power to the full, but through their lack of provisions got diverted into farming the Chersonese and into plunder. And with the Greek forces split this way, the Trojans were able to resist them in battle for 10 years, since they, in other words the Trojans, were a match for whatever forces remained behind. In other words, the Trojans were able to fend off whatever amount of Greeks remained who weren't either farming or off plundering. However, if the Greeks had come with additional supplies at the outset and had applied their whole force to the war continuously without resorting to plunder and farming, they would easily have prevailed in battle and captured Troy, since even with less than their full force, they held the Trojans off with whatever part of the army was to hand. And if they had been able to settle down to a siege, They would have taken Troy in less time and with less effort. But instead, just as a lack of resources led to the weakness of previous expeditions, so this particular expedition, despite its great celebrity, and certainly the fact that there was great celebrity is to be indicative of some sort of critique of Homer, but despite its great celebrity, demonstrably fell well short of its reputation and of the received tradition derived from the poets. And so, yes, right there in the end of that sentence, it makes perfectly clear that he's taken a shot at Homer. But notice it's not just a shot at Homer, it's the entire tradition because of how successful Homer had been. And for Thucydides, what that means is because of how hyperbolic Homer had been. And as we've seen, Thucydides is here to bring a very clear-eyed view to his claim that the old is not so great. And again, precisely because the old did not have the techne, the technology, that the new has. And the new, to repeat, for Thucydides, is this thing called Greekness that's building up and to be distinguished from barbarism. And we know that it's still building up because Thucydides is about to tell us in paragraph 12 that the great motions of the Trojan War did not cease. In other words, they did not lead to peace, which is to say rest. And in Thucydides' account, what that means is that the universal motions, the stasis, from the earliest times of Greece were still ongoing despite the Trojan War. And that's to say that barbarism was still ongoing despite the Trojan War. And so that brings us to paragraph 12. Thucydides says the following: of course, even after the Trojan War, Greece was still undergoing population changes and settlement, so there was no period of peaceful development. The long-delayed return of the Greeks from Troy caused great political turmoil, and there was widespread civil strife in cities, causing the departure of exiles who founded new cities. For example, the present-day Boeotians were driven out of Arne by the Thessalians in the 60th year after the fall of Troy, and settled the land that was once called Cadmeus and is now Boeotia. A proportion of them was settled in that land earlier, and it was some of these who went on the expedition against Troy. And in the 80th year after the fall of Troy, the Dorians and the Heraclidae occupied the Peloponnese. After a long course of time, Greece emerged from her difficulties to enjoy a period of peace and security with a stable population. They then started to send out colonies, the Athenians colonizing Ionia and the majority of the islands, the Peloponnesians most of Italy and Sicily, and some places in the rest of Greece. And all of these colonies were founded after the Trojan War. Now there are a few things to keep in mind in this paragraph, and the first concerns the long-delayed return of the Greeks from Troy. Because remember, the previous paragraph contained a powerful critique of Homer, which is to say the greatness of Homer's Greeks based upon their lack of techne in comparison to that of the Greeks during Thucydides' time. And so, of course, to speak of the long-delayed return of the Greeks from Troy, you're still speaking of Homer, and in particular, Homer's Odyssey. And we can say very broadly that Homer's Odyssey is about the mind of Odysseus. So this paragraph is a continuation of the critique of Homer from the previous paragraph. And so a provocative way to phrase this, given the opening sentence of Homer's Odyssey, is that Thucydides could very well be suggesting a competition between the mind of Odysseus and the Athenian mind at its height. But we can only speculate that at this point, so we can place a little question mark over that and return to it if he gives us anything more. But just continuing with what he says here, he says the long-delayed return of the Greeks from Troy resulted in great political instability of Greece. But remember what he had just said in the previous paragraph about the reason for the long delay, namely, that Homer's Greeks were lacking in techne or technology in order to initially defeat the Trojans in a timely or efficient manner. And so the suggestion here being made by Thucydides is that techne or technology could have prevented this. It could have guarded against the political instability among the Greeks themselves as a result of the Trojan expedition. And we can never forget, politike, the art of politics, is itself a techne. And so it could be the case that there's an art of politics that could have maintained internal stability regardless of how long the Greeks were gone at Troy. But be that as it may, Thucydides points out that after a long period of internal instability, which is to say internal motions, political strife, Greece did find its way toward stability. And he mentions in particular the Athenians and then the Peloponnesians. But we especially always want to keep our eye on the Athenians because remember, Thucydides identified himself as an Athenian in the very opening sentence of the text for a very specific reason. And as we've seen, that particular reason is that Athens, more than anywhere else in Greece, represents Greekness, which is to say, mind revealing itself through techne, such that it's able to master the ceaseless flux of the motions, whether they're non-human in the sense of the ocean or the sea, or whether they're human, which is to say, in this case, internal strife. And all of this is simply to say, the greatness of the mind of the Athenians is utterly unique for Thucydides, even and especially in comparison or in contest with the greatness of the mind of Homer's Greeks, and in particular, Homer's Odysseus. The Athenians, for Thucydides, and unlike the Greeks of Homer, at least according to Thucydides, are able to find stability, which is to say that they have a techne that can at least temporarily master the ceaseless flux of both the human and the non-human motions, so much so that they're able to flourish and even send out colonies, which is to say, to establish empire. And of course, keep in mind, the very possibility of sending out colonies is dependent upon a navy. And it's the technological innovation for naval power that's made possible after that long course of time of political instability from which Greece emerges and enjoys peace or rest that Thucydides now turns to in paragraph 13. And it's in this paragraph that we're going to see the rise of the artisan with his craftsmanship, which is to say his techne, that the entirety of the archaeology has been building up towards ever since Thucydides first introduced us to Minos and his navy, through which mind showed itself capable of mastering the various ceaseless flux, whether human or non-human, through techne or technology, which is to say through an art of politics or technological innovation simply. And so beginning in paragraph 13, this is what Thucydides says. As Greece grew more powerful and became more active than before in the acquisition of wealth, tyrannies were established in the cities in most places, and where previously there were hereditary kingships based on fixed privileges, revenues increased and Greece began to equip itself with navies and came to embrace the element of the sea. The Corinthians are said to have been the first to adopt something like the modern approach to shipbuilding, and it was in Corinth that the triremes were first constructed in Greece. Now, as a sidebar, I'll simply say that what's so important about the triremes is that they were warships with 3 banks of oars, and so they were a major improvement upon the previous style, which is to say the older style of the 50-oared ships, or pentaconters. And continuing, Thucydides says, it was Amenocles, a Corinthian shipwright, apparently built 4 ships for the Samians, and it was about 300 years before the end of this war, in other words, before the end of the Peloponnesian War, that he, Amenocles, went to Samos. And so as a sidebar, we can say that the rise of the artisan begins with Amenocles, the shipwright, which is to say the modern style of shipbuilding. And so just continuing, Thucydides says, the earliest sea battle we know about involved the Corinthians against the Corcyraeans, about 260 years before the same date. The Corinthians, with their city established on the isthmus, had from the very earliest times engaged in commerce, while the Greeks of old, both those within the Peloponnese and those outside it, traveled more by land than by sea, and passed through Corinthian territory on their way to see each other. And so the Corinthians became mightily rich, as the ancient poets indicate in calling the place wealthy Corinth. And when the Greeks took to the sea more, the Corinthians acquired ships and cleared the sea of piracy. And by offering a market, both by land and sea, they made their city powerful through the income produced. Now let's just pause and think about how far we've come just in what has been said there. Thucydides began by pointing out that as Greece became more active in the period of peace and rest from the previous paragraph, its accumulation of wealth somehow brings it about that former kingships are replaced by tyrannies. And then there's immediate reference to Greece equipping itself with navies. And with navies, there would seem to be a direct increase of revenues, presumably because of at least two things. There's the increase in commerce, and there's also the clearing away of the pirates on the sea. And the piracy is a rather curious phenomenon, because pirates seem to be only indicative of times of great political upheaval, which is to say political motion, stasis. But always with the rise of techne, pirates are the first to go. And so the pirates seem to be representative of the barbarism that Greekness understands itself to not be. But we just need to keep an eye out for that, because there's something about the rise of the pirates that always seems to be indicative of the breakdown of peace and rest, which is to say that they're indicative of the rise of the motions of the ceaseless flux. But be that as it may, we have the rise here of the artisan, the craftsman, namely Amenocles. Amenocles is the one who puts an end to the old-style design and creation of ships, namely the ships that only have 50 oars, the pentaconters. And his novelty is the design of the trireme warships. And so whereas the older style, the pentaconter, had only 25 oars per side, the trireme had upward of 30, and it was lighter and more maneuverable, among other things. And so this is a major innovation for the navies. And with regard to the piracy and the importance of bringing in revenues from colonies, command of the sea is everything. And what that means is the rise of the artisan or the craftsman is everything. But just finishing off that paragraph, Thucydides adds that later on the Ionians too became a great naval power at the time of the first Persian king Cyrus and his son Cambyses. They, in other words the Ionians, went to war with Cyrus and for some time gained control of the seas in their own area. Polycrates, or Polycrates, depending on however you want to pronounce it, who was tyrant at Samos at the time of Cambyses, he too was able through his sea power to make various islands subject to him, among them Rhenea, which he captured and consecrated to the Delian Apollo, and lastly the Phocians, when they were colonizing Massalia, defeated the Carthaginians in a sea battle. And so that's the entirety of paragraph 13, and Thucydides is going to shed some light on the way that that paragraph ended immediately in paragraph 14. He says the following: "These were the most powerful fleets, but apparently even these, operating many generations after the Trojan War, had few triremes and were instead equipped with pentaconters and long ships just like the earlier fleets. It was only slightly before the Persian Wars and the death of Darius, king of Persia after Cambyses, that triremes were available in any numbers to the tyrants in Sicily and to the Corcyraeans, and these were the last significant navies to be established in Greece before the invasion of Xerxes. The Aeginetans and Athenians, and a few others, had only acquired quite small fleets, and these consisted mostly of pentaconters. It was not until the last moment that Themistocles persuaded the Athenians, when they were at war with the Aeginetans, and when the Persian invasion was imminently expected, to build the ships with which they actually fought their sea battle against them, and even these were not completely decked over." Okay, and so what we see is that the rise of the craftsman, the rise of the artisan, and in particular Amenocles with his new art for the construction of ships for the navies, was a long and slow process. And most importantly, it wasn't until Themistocles was able to persuade the Athenians at the very last minute that they needed the triremes, that the Athenians did in fact adopt this new art. And so what we're seeing right here is that it wasn't the Trojan War that led to the greatness that is Greekness, but rather it was the Persian Wars, because only with the Persian Wars and the persuasion of Themistocles that Athens adopted and embraced the new techne of Amenocles for the construction of their ships and the fortification and strengthening of their own navy. Now, for us today, looking back and reading this, at this particular point, it would be a good time for us to pull out Plutarch and read his life of Themistocles. But I'm going to hold off on that for the moment because a few more comments are in order for us to be able to truly understand just how much Plutarch's life of Themistocles can help us at this point. And so just continuing into paragraph 15, Thucydides says the following: These then were the navies of the Greeks, including both the older and the later ones. Those who actively developed them, however, strengthened their positions greatly in terms of revenue and dominion over others, especially those of them who had insufficient land of their own and who sailed against the islands and subjected these. But on land, not a single war took place from which any new power accrued. All those that did occur were individual disputes between neighbors, and the Greeks did not undertake distant expeditions abroad for foreign conquests, for they had not yet been brought together as subjects of the great powers, nor did they of their own accord make expeditions in common as equal partners, but each fought their individual wars against neighbors. The main exception was the war of long ago between Chalcis and Eretria, when the rest of Greece divided itself into alliances with one side or the other. Okay, so a few really important things happening there. Again, we see how absolutely critical the power of naval strength is for bringing in revenues, whether by commerce or through colonies and empire. And to repeat from the previous paragraph, this did not occur as a result of the Trojan War, which is to say it did not occur as a result of the greatness, according to Homer, of the Greeks. Instead, what Thucydides is emphasizing here is that the greatness of Greekness, and in particular of Athenian Greekness, comes about as a result of Themistocles emphasizing how crucial it is to employ the techne, or the technology, of Amenocles in the fortification and strengthening of their navy. And also notice what Thucydides says there about no land wars leading to any kind of power, because what's happening is that the wars for real power are occurring on the sea. And so technological innovation regarding the navy is so important that it greatly overshadows dominance by land. And one particularly interesting way to think of this is that Greece has arrived at a situation we recognize today in America that gets described as a loss of the frontier, which is to say, manifest destiny has been reached. And so going forward, presumably all great wars are going to be against great peoples outside of Greece, like the Persians, for instance. But as Thucydides' Peloponnesian War itself shows us, this is simply not the case, because he's already said that the Peloponnesian War is greater than all other wars prior to it, which is to say, especially the Trojan War and the Persian Wars. In fact, what's happening right here is that we're seeing how the Persian Wars led to the greatness that is Greekness. And one of the primary reasons for this has everything to do with his observation that the Greeks didn't undertake any large foreign expeditions or foreign conquests because they had not yet been brought together under the great powers, nor did they make any great expeditions united together as equals. And this brings us to a point where we can now briefly turn to Plutarch's Themistocles for benefit in understanding exactly what's being said here. Now let me begin by being perfectly clear about why this is important. First of all, we have the obvious, that it's not immediately clear what the text is saying. But secondly, and possibly just as important, according to Thucydides, what Themistocles does with regard to persuading the Athenians to adopt the new techne, or technology, of the triremes for the navy, Athenian greatness is going to become the meaning of the greatness that is Greekness. And it's very daring what Themistocles suggests. And Plutarch is going to flatly tell us that time and again, Themistocles was always attempting to persuade the Athenians to adopt major innovations. And it's precisely that characteristic of Themistocles, of daring on behalf of growth and power for Athens, that Thucydides himself is about to argue on behalf of for all of Greece. And moreover, this characteristic, common to both Themistocles and Thucydides, would seem to go a long way in explaining Nietzsche's preference for not simply Thucydides, but also for Plutarch, and precisely in the context of the significance or the meaning of history for life itself. which is to say history that is life-affirming, as opposed to some kind of mere antiquarian activity where someone just stuffs their heads full of all kinds of knowledge for no purpose. And in fact, in an amazing passage, in an amazing essay by Nietzsche on the topic of history, Nietzsche flatly says, satiate your soul with Plutarch, and when you believe in his heroes, dare at the same time to believe in yourself. For with 100 such men, raised in this unmodern way, that is to say, become mature and accustomed to the heroic, the whole noisy sham culture of our age could now be silenced forever. And so what I'm suggesting here is that what we're about to find in Plutarch's Life of Themistocles goes a very long way in explaining both Nietzsche's preference for Plutarch and Nietzsche's preference for Thucydides. But let me emphasize, just like at the very beginning, I'm not presenting Plutarch through the lens of Nietzsche, nor am I presenting Thucydides through the lens of Nietzsche. I'm simply connecting some dots that are very important in understanding the relevance of these things, because again, these are not the most fashionable books that have been published by whatever the latest fashionable scribbler of today is. And so what this is ultimately going to show itself as is the power on land of the Spartans versus the power on sea of the Athenians. And also the thrust of the entire paragraph, and following from the previous paragraph, which itself is a culmination of the entirety of all the paragraphs so far, is that we see in the archaeology itself, which is to say these first opening 20 or so paragraphs, a parallel to what we're going to see in that most famous, if not most infamous, speech that's given by Pericles, namely the funeral oration, where he holds Athens itself up as the paradigm for mind revealing itself for all the Greeks to imitate. He's going to say that Athens is the school of Hellas, which is to say all of Greece is to learn from the way in which mind shows itself in Athens. But we're not there yet. But let's just point out here that absolutely everything about the archaeology, as we've been studying it here very meticulously, is pointing towards Pericles' funeral oration. And what that means is that the coming into being of the greatness that is Greekness, as we've been covering it here in the archaeology, is to be compared with what we're going to find in Pericles' funeral oration. But I'll have a lot more to say about that once we get to the end of the archaeology, because what's going to happen is that Thucydides is going to end the archaeology, which is to say he's going to end the logos or the argument that he's been providing in all these paragraphs about the coming into being of the greatness of the Greeks to their height at the Peloponnesian War, by turning to a discussion of what's going to make the rest of his entire inquiry so very unique and what we have not at all seen in the archaeology up to this point. Namely, he's going to address why it is that the text itself is so full of speeches by all the various people in the Peloponnesian War. In other words, Thucydides is going to give us an account of what's so important to understand about what we would otherwise think of as the literary character of the text. And so he's going to turn us back to our initial observations about how it is that Thucydides' Peloponnesian War is not mere history, but it's also not philosophy, neither is it poetry. But we're not quite there yet. We've got just a few more paragraphs to go. So I'm just going to read here a few of the relevant passages from the Life of Themistocles from Plutarch. And the first concerns what we might think of as his education, because this is going to be very revealing for the greatness that he brings about in Athens, and which Thucydides is going to have so much praise for. And this is what Plutarch says. Themistocles was a slow and reluctant student of subjects which were moral in tone, or which were designed to promote a cultured sense of pleasure and delight, and he showed an unchildlike contempt for a merely theoretical approach to intelligence and practical activity, preferring instead to rely on his natural abilities. He was an admirer of Mnesiphilus of Phrygia, a man who was not an orator, or one of the so-called natural scientists. The Greek word there is the physiologoi, meaning what we would today think of as the pre-Socratics, But instead, Mnesiphilus cultivated what passed in those days for wisdom, that is, political ingenuity and practical intelligence, and he preserved it as if it were the teaching of a philosophical sect, passed down from one generation to another, from Solon onwards. Mnesiphilus' successors, who combined this teaching with forensic skills and diverted its application away from practical activities and towards oratory, were the so-called sophists. Okay, and so in the opening sentence there, what Plutarch is telling us is that Themistocles had contempt for a merely theoretical approach to intelligence and practical activity. The Greek word there for intelligence being sunesis and practical activity being praxis. And the point is that Themistocles did not like to merely contemplate these things. He wanted to see them in action. And so he's drawn away from the natural scientists or the physiologoi and towards Mnesiphilus, because as it's said there of Mnesiphilus, his wisdom, and the Greek word used there is sophia, so his wisdom consisted in political ingenuity, and the Greek there is denotete politiken, and practical intelligence, where the Greek there is drastition sunesis. And for our purposes here, an understanding of the valence of those words in Greek is going to be definitive. So Mnesiphilus' wisdom consists, on the one hand, of political ingenuity, denotita politiken, and it's that adjective there, denotita, that's so extremely important. Its valence of meaning as an adjective ranges from terribleness to harshness to shrewdness to cleverness. And so we're in the realm of clever politics. And the problem with being clever is that it absolutely can be terrible, because simply being clever is not in and of itself a virtue, but it is a power of mind. And Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics is going to have a lot to say about this, precisely because it's very problematic. It is a powerful source of knowledge, but it's unyoked, or we could say it's not of necessity yoked to virtue as such. So being clever, and especially being politically clever, means that one can pull off things and accomplish things that are either good or evil. That's what makes its valence into the realm of terrible so interesting. And it's going to be Martin Heidegger much later who's going to place an enormous amount of emphasis on this word, and in particular as it arises in one of the choral odes in the Greek tragedy Antigone. But the point here for us is that this kind of politics is exactly what we would recognize today as Machiavellian politics, which is to say not so much concerned with the truth as found or discovered through contemplation, but rather effectual truth, truth that simply gets the job done, whether or not it's right or wrong. That's what Themistocles is drawn to. And as concerns the other component in Mnesiphilus' teaching, namely practical intelligence, the Greek there is drasterion sunesis, and the valence of that word drasterion ranges from vigorous to active to efficacious. And so when you think of the conjunction of these two things, which constitute the teaching of Mnesiphilus, you have vigorous, active, efficacious knowledge that is clever. And so you absolutely have all of the most powerful components of what we understand as Machiavellian politics, or in the language that we often hear today, realpolitik. And it's that which Themistocles is drawn to, and that's going to be the source and the motivation of the daring innovations that he's always persuading the Athenians to adopt, and most especially with regard to adopting the techne for the navy of Menocles' triremes, but also that other line that was rather perplexing in the paragraph concerning the Greeks uniting together as subjects of the great powers. And with regard to that first innovation, the techne of Menocles and the triremes, this is what Plutarch says. Themistocles was so carried away by his desire for recognition and so passionately longed to achieve something important, that is, he was so ambitious, that while he was still young, when the generalship of Miltiades was the talk of the town after the battle of Marathon against the Persians, he could very often be found wrapped up in his own thoughts, and he lay awake at night, and turn down opportunities for carousing, as was his usual habit. And when people expressed surprise at this change in his life and asked him about it, he told them that Miltiades' trophy would not let him sleep. In other words, the victory at Marathon would not let Themistocles sleep. And Plutarch says, for while everyone else thought that the Persian defeat at Marathon was the end of the war, Themistocles saw it as the start of a greater contest. And he therefore set about oiling himself and training his city to champion all Greece, since he looked far into the future and saw what was to come. The first consequence of this was that although the Athenians were accustomed to distribute among themselves the revenue from the silver mines at Larium, Themistocles was the only one who dared to come forward in the assembly and argue that they had to stop the distribution. He proposed that they should use the money from the mines to build a fleet for the war against the Aeginetans, which was the most intense war being fought in Greece at the time, and in which the Aeginetans had control of the seas, thanks to the size of their fleet. And he opportunistically made use of the bitterness of his fellow citizens' rivalry with Aegina as a way of getting the fleet built. The money from Larium went towards the construction of 100 triremes, which were also used in the war at sea against Xerxes. Now, just as a quick sidebar, it took everything for me not to title this entire recording The Trophy of Miltiades, because as we see, and as we're going to see even more, the inability to rest content with the trophy of Miltiades, which is to say the defeat of the Persians at Marathon, is a really beautiful image for what sets Themistocles into motion to move Athens in the direction of greatness that ends up having such a powerful influence on none other than Thucydides. And so we can say in a kind of condensed way that the trophy of Miltiades and the refusal to allow it to be enough is ultimately the source of the greatness that becomes Greekness according to Thucydides. It's what separates the Greeks of Thucydides' time from all other earlier Greeks. And in particular, going back to the very opening paragraph, it's the source of the Athenians being at their highest preparation for the war. And to repeat, that also means it's the source of the Athenians being at their height of peace, which is to say the period of time in which mind has been afforded enough rest from the ceaseless flux of all the human and non-human motions, such that it can master them through various kinds of techne and most reveal itself through those various techne. And at the same time, notice that it's Themistocles' daring that shows itself in relationship to those techne that is itself going to destabilize the rest that mind has achieved in mastering those various human and non-human motions. And there's the universal from within the particular that Thucydides has laid claim to in that opening paragraph, that his text, the Peloponnesian War, is in the process of justifying. And now skipping ahead just a little bit, in the life of Themistocles and Plutarch still, so that we can understand that meaning of the great powers that united all the Greeks for distant expeditions that Thucydides spoke of in paragraph 15 that we're still in. Plutarch says the following: Themistocles' greatest achievement was to end all the inter-Greek fighting and get the various states to come to terms with one another by persuading them that their hostilities should take second place to the war with Persia. And so it's precisely that persuasion of getting the Greeks to stop fighting each other and join together in a larger cause that was Themistocles' greatest achievement. And that unity together is what those great powers are that Thucydides is referring to in paragraph 15. They're going to be the various leagues. But the reason that this is mysterious right now is because this is Thucydides already knowing what happens in building up to the war after the events of the archaeology that we're still in. And so now we're in a better position to turn back to Thucydides to understand that passage and also prepared for what Thucydides is about to say on that topic as well. And that's going to involve the pettiness of all the tyrants that popped up back in paragraph 13 after the period of instability due to the long delay of the Greeks back from Troy that then paved the way for a long period of rest. But first we have this brief paragraph 16 that follows paragraph 15 that we've been exploring here. And so I'll just read what Thucydides says in it. Different states encountered different obstacles to growth. In the case of the Ionians, they were making great progress when King Cyrus and the Persians, after conquering Croesus, invaded all the territory between the river Halys and the sea and enslaved the cities on the mainland. And later, Darius used his Phoenician fleet to conquer the islands too. Okay, and so that's the entirety of the paragraph. And it might seem odd, but notice what the theme there was: growth and the obstacles to growth. And precisely that encompasses everything that we turn to Plutarch's Themistocles to understand about paragraph 15. And so what paragraph 16 is doing is it's providing an introductory commentary on the very important but perplexing subjects that arose in 15, namely undertaking distant expeditions, foreign conquests, and common unity in great power, which is to say the leagues, what Plutarch told us was the greatest accomplishment of Themistocles. And we're going to see the relevance of all that immediately in paragraph 16, where Thucydides is going to refer back to those mysterious tyrannies that cropped up previously in paragraph 13, after the slow growth of Greece from the long period of instability that was caused because of the 10-year delay of the Greeks returning from Troy, which itself was because the Greeks that went to Troy didn't have the requisite techne to get the job done efficiently and in a timely manner. And so what we're witnessing is what I've mentioned a few times already, namely that techne is not simply advancement in things non-human for human purposes, such as the triremes. Techne, or technology, is that, but it's also more. Politics is itself an art, politike, the art of politics, and we're witnessing both of these being juxtaposed so that they can go hand in hand, as Minos used them in establishing the first navy as a ruler. And that's what we're going to see here in paragraph 17, namely the importance of techne for great expeditions and techne for unity of peoples for power. And so just continuing into paragraph 17, this is what Thucydides says. As for the tyrants in Greek cities, their first thoughts were always for themselves, for their personal well-being, and the aggrandizement of their private households. And they therefore ran their cities with safeguarding this foremost in their minds, and never achieved anything significant except in individual actions against their neighbors. And those in Sicily did indeed make very great advances in power this way. But nonetheless, Greece, on all sides, and for a long time, was held back from accomplishing anything notable in terms of joint action, and the individual cities were lacking in enterprise. Now, it's particularly helpful for us to understand the word that's being used there for lacking enterprise. The Greek is etalmotera eine, where the word eine just simply means to be. And so it's etalmotera that is so crucial here, because its meaning is cowardly, or lacking spirit, or lacking courage, or most especially lacking daring. And remember, it's daring that is so absolutely crucial for our ability to understand the greatness that is Greekness according to Thucydides. And so what we're seeing here is that the pettiness of the tyrants, always acting only on behalf of their own self-aggrandizement, making it impossible for them to achieve anything in unity, has the consequence that Greece as a whole lacks daring. Now, I just need to point out the exception that's being made for Sicily, which is just hilarious, because Sicily is always going to be the exception to the rule. And it seems to be the case that Thucydides is planting the seeds all along the way in his account of the Peloponnesian War for why it is that the Greeks end up with a kind of obsession for Sicily. But Athens in particular is going to have this obsession, and it's going to be the wholesale blindness of Athens as a result of its daring and the enormity of the enterprise they undertake in their attempted conquest of Sicily that is ultimately going to be the downfall of the greatness of the Athenians. And also notice the juxtaposition between paragraph 16 and paragraph 17. The barbarians, in other words the Persians, they were not lacking in daring. They were attempting to conquer the Greeks. But in paragraph 17, we see that the Greeks are too busy with the pettiness of all the various tyrants, that greatness in the form of expeditions, foreign conquests, these are utterly foreign to the Greeks, precisely because their art of politics is petty. It's simply defective. It is ignoble and incapable of greatness. And remember from the life of Themistocles and Plutarch, we saw that it was the greatest achievement of Themistocles to be able to unite the Greeks. And it's on that point that paragraph 18 and especially paragraph 19 are going to bring the archaeology to a close. And so continuing into paragraph 18, this is what Thucydides says. Eventually, nearly all the tyrants in Athens and in the rest of Greece, most of which was ruled by tyrants from an earlier time, were finally deposed by the Spartans, although those in Sicily were an exception. And so we see Sicily again being the exception. But just continuing, note that Sparta, though it went through the longest known period of civil strife after its present inhabitants, the Dorians, had taken possession of it, Sparta has nonetheless enjoyed good government from a very early period and has always been free of tyranny. For rather more than 400 years before the date of the end of this war, the Spartans have had the same constitution and have consequently been powerful enough to settle the affairs of other states as well as their own. After this final expulsion of the tyrants from Greece, it was not many years before the Battle of Marathon took place between the Persians and the Athenians. Okay, and so there you have it in paragraph 18, the role of techne as an art of rule. And in fact, the Greek word that's used there, when Thucydides says that the Spartans have had good government, is eunomia, which is a compound of the prefix eu, meaning well or good, and nomos, meaning law. And so the proper art of politics, of a founder of a people, is to establish good law, and the proper art of statesmanship is to ensure that that founding endures, even and especially after the lawgiver is gone. But just continuing, Thucydides says, 10 years after this, in other words, 10 years after the Battle of Marathon, the barbarian, which is to say the Persians, returned to invade Greece with a mighty armada, intent on enslavement. With great danger impending, the Spartans, as the preeminent power, assumed leadership of the allied Greek forces, and the Athenians, having resolved to abandon their city in the face of the Persian advance, packed up their possessions, took to their boats, and became sailors. Now, just as a sidebar, Themistocles is absolutely instrumental in all of that. And the point here in Thucydides is that as a result of that invasion, the Athenians became sailors, which is to say they are only getting better as a naval power. And then continuing, the barbarian, which is to say the Persians, was repulsed by a common effort. There we have it. There we have the common effort, the unity. But not much later, both the Greeks who were in revolt from the Persian king and those who had fought together as allies became divided between the Athenian side and the Spartan side. In other words, what is happening is that the leagues that were formed, the alliances of the Greeks to stop their internal fighting, those leagues, those alliances, are breaking apart. And Thucydides does not name it right here, and he's about to simply call it a dispute. But this turns out to be the origin or the truest cause of the Peloponnesian War. And just continuing, the Athenians and the Spartans were quite clearly the two greatest powers, the one dominant on land, the other by sea. For a short time, this defensive alliance held together. Then the Spartans and the Athenians got into a dispute and made war on each other with their respective allies. And any of the Greeks who had ever had differences of their own now joined one of these groupings. And so what we're seeing here is back in paragraph 15, those great powers that were mentioned, those are the Spartans and the Athenians, because it's the Spartans and Athenians who all the rest of the Greeks follow. And just continuing, Thucydides says, so over the whole time from the Persian Wars up to the present war, in other words, from the Persian Wars up to the Peloponnesian War, while sometimes under truce and sometimes fighting, either with each other or with allies who had revolted, the two sides developed their readiness for war and got training in the hard school of experience. Now it's that last line right there, the hard school of experience, that prefigures what I had mentioned previously. Thucydides says in his own name, namely, that war is a hard master. But what's important for us to see right here in the ending of this paragraph 18 is that Thucydides is summarizing the entirety of the period between the Persian War and the Peloponnesian War, which is to say that Thucydides is summarizing here the origins or the causes of the Peloponnesian War. And it's going to turn out that this has an enormous amount to do with techne. But let me simply finish the archaeology by reading paragraph 19. Thucydides continues by saying the Spartans exercised their leadership not by making their allies subject to tribute, but by taking good care to ensure that they were governed by oligarchies and served Spartan interests exclusively. The Athenians, by contrast, ruled by taking possession of the ships of allied cities over time and by imposing fixed taxes on all these. Their own military resources available for this war, in other words, the military resources of the Athenians, was therefore greater than it had ever been when the alliance against Persia was intact and at the height of its power. Okay, and so that's the end of the archaeology. And what Thucydides has done is he's brought us to a summary of the events that lead up to the war. And then in that last paragraph 19, he's held up for our consideration the very different arts of rule employed on the one hand by the Spartans for their colonies and empire versus that of the Athenians for their colonies of empire. And the primary difference is that whereas the Spartans did not impose tributes on their colonies of empire, the Athenians did impose tributes. And not only tributes, but they also took the people's navies as well. And so what we have is a very powerful land force with the Spartans and a very powerful sea force with the Athenians. But at the more fundamental level, the difference between the Spartans and the Athenians, which is only reflected in Spartans' land power and the Athenian sea power, is that Athens is the city of innovation and Sparta is the city of traditional piety. And so the question here is whether or not it's the piety of Sparta that prevails against the revolutionary Athenians, at least according to Thucydides. But remember, there's no mention of the divine or the gods in the archaeology. But that being said, the culmination of this more fundamental tension of traditional piety and radical innovation happens later in Book 1. But before I address it, we have to see the amazing turn of events that Thucydides is going to make immediately here in order to end the archaeology and explain what's going to happen in the rest of the text. And what I mean by that is Thucydides is about to tell us his method of inquiry regarding the events of the Peloponnesian War that we're now entering into and that he's just summarized. And so just beginning with paragraph 20, Thucydides says the following: "These, then, are my findings about early history, though it is difficult to be sure of every detail in the evidence, since people accept quite uncritically any reports of the past they get from others, even those relating to their own country. The great majority of Athenians, for example, think that Hipparchus was tyrant when he was killed by Harmodius and Aristogeiton, and they're unaware that Hippias, as the oldest of the sons of Pisistratus, was the ruler, while Hipparchus and Thessalus were his younger brothers. In fact, on the very day in question, indeed right at the last minute, Harmodius and Aristogeiton suspected that Hippias had been told something by one of their fellow conspirators, and believing him to be forewarned, held back from him. But since they were still willing to risk their lives in achieving something before being arrested, when they ran into Hipparchus by the shrine called Leocorium while he was organizing the Pan-Athenaic procession, they killed him. The other Greeks, too, have many other mistaken beliefs about matters that are current now, as well as those from the dim and distant past, such as thinking that the Spartan kings each cast not one but 2 votes, and that they have a special pitonate unit of troops, which never actually existed. So little trouble do people take to search out the truth, and so readily do they accept what first comes to hand." All right, now that entire paragraph is extremely important, but it's admittedly complicated, But just to begin with the last sentence there, it's a conclusion that he's making from everything he has said previously in that paragraph. And notice that it's a claim to human nature. And so just to repeat it, so little trouble do people take to search out the truth, and so readily do they accept what first comes to hand. Now, I'm personally a fan of the Hobbes translation, and the way that Hobbes translates the Greek right here is that he says, so impatient of labor are most men in search of truth, and they embrace soonest the things that are next to hand. And again, to emphasize, that's a deduction or a conclusion from everything that's been said previously in the paragraph. And I'll explain how, but it's important for us to realize that is a claim about human nature. And so it may very well be the case that the opening sentence to Aristotle's Metaphysics is true, namely, that all men by nature stretch themselves out towards learning. It could also, in fact, be true that just because all men stretch themselves out towards learning, in stretching themselves out towards learning, they become very impatient and simply lazy very quickly. And let me lastly point out something that is extremely important. The deduction or the conclusion that Thucydides is making there regarding man's laziness towards the truth and simply accepting whatever is closest at hand. And the Greek word there is etoima and means at hand or ready or prepared. And so while it's a figure of speech and one that we still recognize in our own language, it's going to turn out that this means everything for Heidegger with regard to everything that comes tumbling out of his inquiry into art and nature, which is to say being itself, and in particular for our purposes in this series, Heidegger's teaching on technology as a question. And so that figure of speech of simply accepting as true that which is closest at hand or ready or prepared carries more significance than we can possibly imagine right now. But the important fact is that it's here and in a very significant way. So we underscore and we highlight it right now so that we don't lose sight of it in everything going forward until we get to Heidegger. But be that as it may, what Thucydides is telling us here is that he is not one of those people, and the reader that he wants is also not one of those people. But in order to properly understand politics, and especially the extreme, which is to say war, you have to know the nature of man so that your governance of man corresponds with his nature. And one way that I like to phrase this is to say that to expect more of reason than reason itself is capable of in politics is itself unreasonable. And that's going to be a point of commonality between Thucydides and Plato and Aristotle, despite their enormous differences on other fundamentals. But okay, how does Thucydides deduce that from the paragraph? Setting aside all the names for a moment, what Thucydides is saying is that most Athenians don't even know the history of their own city. And what that means is that they don't know the history of their own, which is to say that which they should love the most, their people, their way of life, its origins. And it's even worse because what Thucydides is saying is that that ignorance is willful precisely because they're lazy. The common understanding, which is to say the vulgar understanding, is that Hipparchus was the tyrant, and that the Athenians being liberated from the tyranny of the Pisistratus came about as a result of Harmodius and Aristogeiton murdering Hipparchus. And what Thucydides is claiming here is that no, Hipparchus was not the tyrant. In fact, it was Hippias who was the ruler. And so, okay, full stop. There are two things that have been claimed. The Athenians fundamentally don't recognize or sufficiently understand tyranny itself because they don't seem to understand that it was Hippias, not Hipparchus, who was the ruler, which is to say who was the tyrant. And second, they fail to recognize or understand what it was that actually freed them from the tyranny, because Hipparchus being murdered would change absolutely nothing if it's the case that Hippias was the ruler, which is to say the tyrant. And in fact, we can say it runs even deeper than that, because over the past few paragraphs, Thucydides has been pointing out the weaknesses of the ancient things, and the poets in particular. And yet here, immediately at the conclusion of the archaeology, Thucydides doesn't use an ancient example. He uses a modern example. And so it turns out that the failure of judgment, which is to say the weakness that was going on with the ancient things, is still present. In other words, and even more provocatively, the weakness of the ancient Athenians is still the weakness of the modern Athenians. And the failure of the modern Athenians to even be able to recognize a tyrant, that's going to show itself again. And it's going to show itself with just about the most important person in all of Thucydides' text, namely Alcibiades, because the fear or the rumor about Alcibiades is that he was in favor of a return to the tyranny. And so the failure of the Athenians in their handling of Alcibiades is a direct result of their ongoing, their long-standing failure to recognize tyranny as such. And that opens the door to the question of what is the polis supposed to do with someone as capable in the art of politics as Alcibiades. And while that's a question that we're not going to be able to address in this discussion, it's at least extremely important that that question, as a question, be on our horizon, because what it shows is how techne, or technology, extends beyond the mastery of the non-human motions for human purposes, such as the triremes over the ocean, and into the mastery of the human motions, which is to say the human passions, for the most significant human purposes, which is to say the most consequential human purposes. And this is what I've been pointing out all along regarding politics or statesmanship as an art. It's the art of the mastery of the human passions that are the very source of all the human motions. And so for our purposes here, the significance of paragraph 20 is that the ancient things have not been known, and they're still not known according to Thucydides. And that lack of knowledge is in fact going to show itself in the Peloponnesian War. And that's why Thucydides has used a modern example in his conclusion on the ancient things of the archaeology. And so now, continuing from that deduction at the end of paragraph 20 about the laziness of not just ancient man, but especially even modern man, which is to say the laziness of man in general, or man simply, Thucydides continues that thought in paragraph 21 as follows. From the evidence I have presented, however, one would not go wrong in supposing that events were very much as I have set them out, and no one should prefer rather to believe the songs of the poets who exaggerate things for artistic purposes, or the writings of the chroniclers, which are composed more to make good listening than to represent the truth, being impossible to check, and having most of them won a place over time in the imaginary realm of fable. My findings, however, you can regard as derived from the clearest evidence available for material of this antiquity. Now, just as a sidebar, there's a more literal way to translate that sentence, and what it reads as follows. From the stated evidences, nevertheless, someone would not go wrong by considering what I have recounted to be very much of that kind, in other words, reliable, not rather believing as the poets have sung with decorated exaggeration concerning these matters, or as the chroniclers, in a manner more attractive to hear than true, have composed things that are incapable of being disproved, and things that have, many of them in time, won their way into the fabulous in a way that cannot be believed. But one would not go wrong, considering what I have recounted, to have been researched from the clearest evidences, given that the manners are sufficiently ancient. And then Thucydides ends that paragraph with the following. And so back to this war, men always think that the war that they're engaged in at the moment is the greatest one ever. And then when it's over, they're more impressed by earlier ones. Nevertheless, for those who look at the facts, this war will prove to be greater than the earlier ones. All right, so what we need to recognize here in paragraph 21 is that Thucydides is distinguishing his activity from the activity of two other particular kinds of crafts, namely the poets and the chroniclers, which is to say the poetae and the logographoi. And it's because, as he says, the poets over-exaggerate things, whereas the chroniclers, or the logographoi, sacrifice truth, or at the very least, accuracy, in favor of pleasurable eloquence. And so what this means concerning the deduction or the conclusion that Thucydides has just drawn at the end of the previous paragraph regarding man's laziness towards the truth is that men prefer those things that are exaggerated and those things which are pleasurable to hear. And so what Thucydides is telling us is that his account of the Peloponnesian War is not going to be over-exaggerated, nor is it necessarily going to be pleasurable to hear. And another way to phrase this that is extremely helpful for where we're going in this series with Heidegger and the contemporary question of technology as a question is that man prefers that which is ready or present at hand more than he prefers the work required to discern the truth, precisely because that which is ready or present at hand is over-exaggerated and or simply more pleasurable. And so underline and highlight that because we absolutely are going to have to come back to that throughout this series on technology and nihilism time and time again. But just continuing, he ends paragraph 21 by pointing out that man's laziness also shows itself in thinking that all the things of the present moment are the greatest things ever, and only through hindsight do people look back upon previous things and think that the previous things might in fact have been better or greater in significance. In other words, this is an acknowledgement by Thucydides that the default position of man is to privilege the present to the past, or as we might otherwise say, the default of man is to believe that whatever is latest is greatest. And we see this always and especially regarding thought itself, which is to say that we tend to always privilege thinkers of the present over and against thinkers of the past. And that's really why I'm including Thucydides in our run-up in this series to the thought of the various 19th and 20th century thinkers like Nietzsche, Jung, Heidegger, Strauss, etc. And what Thucydides is saying about this is, look, bear with me, because I realize that that is how most men are. But what I'm telling you is that the Peloponnesian War was, in fact, the greatest war prior to all the previous wars. And this leads us directly into the culmination of the entire archaeology and Thucydides' amazing statement about the rest of the way that he's going to conduct the inquiry into the Peloponnesian War, because he's about to tell us that not only is the Peloponnesian War greater than all the previous wars, but in fact, it is a possession for all time. And that speaks directly to that opening paragraph we discussed, where Thucydides' claim is that he has found a universal within the particular of the Peloponnesian War. And what's so amazing about it is that it's going to concern precisely that which we have not seen at all in the archaeology, namely what we would otherwise think of as Thucydides' literary style, which is to say the speeches that he's going to sprinkle the rest of the text with. And so just jumping into paragraph 22, this is what Thucydides says. As to what was said in speeches by the various parties, either before they went to war or during the conflict itself, it was difficult for me to recall the precise details in the case of those I heard myself, just as it was for those who reported back to me on cases elsewhere. What I have set down is how I think each of them would have expressed what was most appropriate in the particular circumstances, while staying as close as possible to the overall intention of what was actually said. As to the events of the war themselves, however, I resolved not to rely in my writing on what I learned from chance sources, or even on my own impressions, but both in the cases where I was present myself and in those where I depended on others, I investigated every detail with the utmost concern for accuracy. This was a laborious process of research, because eyewitnesses at the various events reported the same things differently, depending on which side they favored and on their powers of memory. Perhaps the absence of the element of fable in my work may make it seem less easy on the ear, but it will have served its purpose well enough if it is judged useful by those who want to have a clear view of what has happened in the past and what, the human condition being what it is, can be expected to happen again sometime in the future in similar or much the same ways. It is composed to be a possession for all time and not just a performance piece for the moment. All right, so this paragraph contains the most important thing in all of Thucydides to help us understand why it is the case that Thucydides is not doing mere history, or what we would think of today as scientific history. In fact, what the paragraph is telling us is Thucydides' understanding of the relationship between speeches and deeds. And as he tells us, the speeches come close to what was said, but they're not exact. And in the cases of the speeches where he wasn't even present, what he provides is what he thought was needed to be said given the particular circumstances. And so they're reconstructions by Thucydides. And so all the speeches in the text, which if I'm not mistaken is 141 total, are what Thucydides thought was said, or what Thucydides understands as needing to have been said. And notice also that he tells us what the problem with all speeches is, namely that they're partial, which is to say that they're political, because people are always biased towards one side or the other. And that's simply to say that speeches are always given as addressing a very particular audience under very particular circumstances. But what does that tell us about Thucydides? Because remember, he claims in the opening sentence to be an Athenian. So how is it that Thucydides' speech, which is the entire text of the Peloponnesian War itself, how does it transcend the political in order to reveal the truth simply, which is to say the universal that he claims to have found in that opening paragraph? I think the best way to understand how to answer that question is to understand what Athens represents for Thucydides, which is to say the greatness that is Greekness. In other words, the precondition of Thucydides' own speech that's going to be universal is the universal city of Athens. And Athens is the universal city because it's the city in which mind reveals itself best. And this is to say that Athens is the source of what we might otherwise just simply say is philosophy. And so no Athens means no philosophy, means no Thucydides, because understanding as such depends upon the city of Athens. And so what we see is that Thucydides is providing the highest possible praise for Athens, because what Athens provides or makes possible is human understanding as such. And contained in that claim is everything that we understand for this particular series as technology and nihilism. Because on the one hand, techne, or technology, is the way in which mind reveals itself. And on the other hand, regarding nihilism, or we should say in this case, man's relationship and understanding to the divine, for Thucydides, it seems to be wholly political, because as I've said, it depends entirely upon the coming into being of Athens from imperfect origins. That's the purpose of the archaeology, to point out the imperfect origins from which the greatness of Athens, which is to say the greatness of Greekness, is made possible. This is very different from Plato and Aristotle, and I'll go into this in my various discussions on, for instance, Plato's laws and Aristotle's politics. But suffice it to say here that for both Plato and Aristotle, the origin of philosophy is not political. It's not the city. And for Plato in particular, it seems to be the case that the origin of philosophy, at least in the Laws, which is his longest dialogue, is the unknown God. And it is us, humans, who are the puppets of that unknown God. But all of that concerns the speeches. And notice that the precondition for the speeches is the deeds, namely the coming into being of Greekness that is the greatness of Athens. And so the deeds are prior to the speeches. And we can state this alternatively by saying that the political is prior to the philosophical. And what this means, at least according to Thucydides, is that in contrast to both the poets and the chroniclers, is that the speeches will not magnify or transcend the deeds. In other words, the telos, or the purpose of the speeches, is not for the sake of the beautiful or the pleasant. The deeds themselves are primary. Because again, and just to emphasize, the precondition for the speech is the deed. And so the deed always has to come first. And so returning to that very first thing that I had mentioned about Thucydides representing a fundamental alternative to both Plato and Aristotle, is that speech is always conditioned by the political order within which one finds oneself. And this is fundamentally different from what we find in Plato or Aristotle, because in Plato and Aristotle, what we get is that speech in its highest form, which is to say the philosophical life, permits access to what we would otherwise think of as the phenomenological whole, namely the world of man and the cosmos together, or more simply put, intelligibility as such. That is not what we have in Thucydides, because for the political or the deed to be prior to speech means that the primary task of man is first to overcome necessity. Now, there's an enormous amount more that can be said there, but that's what the purpose of reading the rest of the text is for. And so let me just close by mentioning what I had said previously about the culmination in Book 1 of the tension between Sparta, representing the tradition of piety, versus Athens, which represents innovation or revolution. Now, ultimately, this is going to concern a comparison of what Archidamus, the king of Sparta, has to say versus Pericles' funeral oration speech. But the very specific passage I have in mind is paragraph 70 in Book 1. And what this is a speech given by the Corinthians to the Spartans against the Athenians. And this is only one selection from the entirety of the speech, but it's the most important for that opposition that I'm talking about. And this is what the Corinthians say. Surely we, if anyone, have the right to level complaints against our neighbors, especially when such large differences are at stake, and ones to which you, the Spartans, are quite insensitive in our view. You, in other words the Spartans, seem never once to have analyzed these Athenians to see just what sort of people you are going to be up against, nor how totally different they are from yourselves. For they are innovators, quick to have ideas, and then to put their plans into action. Your instinct, on the other hand, is to keep things as they are, not to make any new decisions, and not even to take the minimum action necessary. Whereas they, the Athenians, are bold beyond their means. They run risks beyond reason and stay sanguine in times of trouble. Your way, on the other hand, is to do less than your powers allow, to distrust even your surest judgment, and never to expect deliverance from dangers. In truth, they, the Athenians, never shrink from action, while you always hesitate. They're always abroad, while you never leave home. They expect to gain something by being away, whereas you expect that by venturing out, you might harm even what you have. In any military success, they press their advantage to the limit, and in defeat, they fall back as little as possible. Their bodies they disown and sacrifice to the service of the state, but their minds are very much their own in acting on her behalf. And if they fail to go and achieve something they have planned on doing, they believe they have been deprived of what was already theirs, while if they succeed in getting what they went for, they count that as a small gain compared with future prospects. And should they actually fail in some venture, they redirect their hopes to make good the loss elsewhere. For them alone, to hope for something is to have it. Such is their speed in executing their plans. This, then, is their lifelong labor in hardship and in danger. They scarcely enjoy what they have because they're always after getting more. The only holiday they can imagine is in doing what they feel they must, and they think of idle leisure as a greater disaster than irksome toil. And so in conclusion, you could rightly say that they are born neither to enjoy any peace themselves nor to allow it to others. And then just skipping ahead a little bit into paragraph 71, the Corinthians continue as follows. We have just demonstrated your practices are antiquated compared to those of the Athenians. Inevitably, it's the new that prevails. In other words, it's the technological that prevails. In this, which is to say politics in general, and foreign policy in particular, as in other fields of expertise, or we could say in other fields of techne or technology. And just to close it out there, the Corinthians say, it's true that in times of peace, a city's established practices are best left undisturbed, but when one is forced into greater activity, the need for innovation also grows. And that is why the more varied experience of the Athenians has led to greater changes there. And so there you have it. You have everything. This issue of techne, of innovation, technology, is and has always been deeply, deeply bound up into the very nature of political community. And what this means is that the claim that man is by nature rational stands in a very tense relationship to the other claim that man is by nature political. And that really encompasses everything of why I think that Thucydides is so extremely important to include in any discussion of technology, precisely because he does not separate what we would otherwise be inclined to think of as some kind of metaphysical element to technology from the absolutely crucial element of man in political community. Okay, and so there's so very, very much more that I could add to all of this because the text only gets better and better. Because remember, we're still not even out of book one, and we only just now touched upon the speeches that really constitute the rest of the entire text. But if you like this subject and the way that I go about inquiring into these old great books, I really hope that you consider subscribing to my website, Athens Corner, because I'm able to provide so very much more there than I am here on these various podcast platforms. And if you made it through the entirety of this whole discussion, I simply can't thank you enough for your time, and I really hope you enjoyed it as much as I have.